Hyperborean Radio proudly presents Kulturkampf, a podcast dedicated to philosophy, literature, and culture. This is Titus Flavius. Welcome to episode 57, where we will be discussing Julius Evola once again and his work, Men Amongst the Ruins. Joining me in the Camera Stellata, we have Leto. Hello, sir.
Hello. Welcome to the 7-hour episode, Men Amongst the Ruins.
We're going to outdo ourselves. Each episode is going to be 2 hours longer. And,
apologies, I have a cold, so if my voice sounds a bit down.
And also, as a special guest, long returning to us from Myth of the 20th Century, on retainer, Nick Mason. Welcome back, sir.
Hey, guys. How are you doing?
Doing well. So let's jump right into the text, gentlemen. We went over the bio and all that stuff in our last episode, so let's get right into it. Leto, do you care to start us off the bat with revolution, counter-revolution, and tradition?
Sure thing. Recently, various forces have attempted to set up a resistance in the socio-political domain against the extreme forms in which the disorder of our age manifests itself. It is necessary to realize that this is a useless effort, even for the sake of merely demonstrative purposes, unless the disease is dealt with at its very roots. These roots, as far as the historical dimension is concerned, are to be found in the subversion introduced in Europe by the revolutions of 1789 and 1848. The disease must be recognized in all of its forms and degrees. Thus, the main task is to establish if there are still men willing to reject all the ideologies, political movements, and parties that, directly or indirectly, derive from those revolutionary ideas. Everything ranging from liberalism, democracy, to Marxism and communism. As a positive counterpart, these men should be given an orientation and a solid foundation consisting of a broad view of life and a stern doctrine of the state. To adopt it and call oneself reactionary is a true test of courage. For quite some time, left-wing movements have made the term reaction synonymous with all kinds of iniquity and shame. They never miss an opportunity to thereby stigmatize all those who are not helpful to their cause and who do not go with the flow, or who do not follow what, according to them, is the course of history. While it is very natural for the left to employ this tactic, I find unnatural the sense of anguish that the term often induces in people due to their lack of political, intellectual, and even physical courage. This lack of courage plagues even the representatives of the so-called right, or quote-unquote national conservatives, who, as soon as they are labelled reactionaries, protest, exculpate themselves, and try to show that they do not desire the label. What is needed, therefore, is a new radical front, with clear boundaries drawn between friends and foes. If this game is not over yet, the future does not belong to those who share in the hybrid of crumbling ideas predominant, even in groups that do not belong to the left, but rather to those who have the courage and to espouse radicalism, namely the radicalism of the absolute negations, of the majestic affirmations, to use the expression dear to Donoso Cortes. It is necessary to specify that reaction does not consist in parrying the movements of the opponent without having anything positive to oppose him with. The word revolution shall no longer signify a violent overthrow of a legitimate establishment order, but rather an action aimed at eliminating a newly emerged disorder and at re-establishing a state of normalcy.
It's worth mentioning that this book, of course, was written after the tragedy of 1945. This book was written in 1953. So it's hard to gauge here the level of despondency that the far right was dealing with the post-war. I'm sure, Nick, you can speak to this. I recall, I think it was Yaki's, in Yaki's journal, he recalls after World War II, this sort of state of absolute depression and hopelessness.
Yeah, I mean, Yaki himself would have placed it at the hanging of the nine, in which the final establishment of the liberal order was imposed on Europe and the occupation. And I think here to tease out the big terms or ideas like revolution and reaction and conservative. I don't think, in the part that Leto just read, he doesn't mention that, but he does go on to pay reference to the conservative revolution, which was a post-World War I movement of German intellectuals, and he is playing around with a lot of these words. As you see, he venerates the word reactionary, as he says, a true test of courage. And I think that it's appropriate to sort of distinguish this from the American perspective. On my show, for instance, I like to avoid using left and right as designations. I think partly because coming from America and having an American audience, I think it's very confused because the right in America is, of course, largely associated with a pro-capitalist viewpoint. And his idea of the right was sort of the state of normalcy before the French Revolution, in which all movements, be it nationalistic or Marxist, fall under this sort of big umbrella. They have the same. They end up having the same quality, and so for him, a reactionary, and he'll even take it further and further back, all the way to the Reformation, and then you get into his sort of metaphysical breakdown of the ages, etc. But just from the American perspective, I mean, this was a country that was founded on liberal principles. So reactionary and right wing, really, like these are words that he's using in a very, very European context that do not apply to America in the same way.
No, not at all. And concerning, to further point out what Todd was saying concerning this particular text I read out, I think after 1945, the idea of having some sort of like peaceful revolution, he's kind of saying, he's kind of putting forth this idea of a conservative revolution and another revolution. And to my idea, that means something quite violent compared to what he would have been espoused previously before the war.
Well, to him, the key is to remain steadfast to certain eternal principles. And things like revolution are sort of defined by the context of the age. And so you get these sort of dialectics that occur where in opposing something, you end up still buying into a certain framework of it. And this is kind of what he's saying as to why it is that the right is afraid of the designation of reactionary, because they're trying to appeal within the same context. And I think a lot of that is what needs to be sold. They don't want to be
stepped over.
Yeah, right. And they're unwilling to do that. They're unwilling to ignore sort of the clamor and demands of the times. And he sees this, of course, as a cowardice.
Yeah.
That the right should hold steadfast to principles that are not contingent and malleable to the age. In this case, it's the age of post-French Revolution, of liberalism, of the great triumvirate of the three ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So that's when he says it's necessary to specify the reaction does not consist in parrying the moves of the opponent without having anything positive to oppose him with. He's throwing out the idea of sort of just the heel dragging conservative.
Yeah, definitely. Well, our relation to the Americans conservative currently, neoconservatism, yeah, his relation to that time period's the right wing.
Right. Do you guys have more on the opening here?
Yeah, well, I think it's for being like the staunch sort of reactionary of Evola. I mean, it is good and comforting for him to sort of recognize the absolute usefulness, the absolute uselessness of quote unquote, conservatism in the modern age, and the modern conception of it. It certainly speaks well to the current times and the current milieu for us as dealing with similar issues. Whether or not conservatism and conservatives in general can sort of be dragged kicking and screaming into more reactionary politics. It's not entirely sure it's a useful endeavor.
Well, I guess I would add again from the American perspective that the link to these traditions, to what he would refer to as the European political tradition. We'll get more into that, but that's America again was not founded on this basis. Right. So for Americans reading this, it's not, the conservative really just does not apply, because we don't even have the memory of this kind of thing. In fact, the founding myth of America was a rejection of exactly what Evola is coming from.
Right.
Definitely. And he pretty much considers it one of the worst things to come out of you. And I was talking about this earlier in the pre-show, his hatred of America. If you get a chance, read the article on Countercurrents, the niggerification of America. He hammers it pretty hard. But what Nick said, where it was kind of, they have no kind of reference point from a beginning, always from the beginning, they've been different, completely foreign to Evola's thoughts, and it's quite hard for anyone to read this book from that kind of worldview. And I guess that kind of applies to the rest of the modern world, especially like Anglo-Saxon countries.
Well, yeah, thanks to America's hegemony over the rest of the Commonwealth and the continent. Yeah, it has to be. It's hard for modern readers, but we'll endeavor to understand it. So,
well, let's look at what his idea of a true state, a true organic state would be. Reading from the second chapter. The foundation of every true state is the transcendence of its own principle, namely the principle of sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy. This essential truth has been variously expressed in the course of history. If this truth was not recognized, the meaning of everything that belongs to political reality would be misunderstood, or at least distorted. Through the multifaceted variety of these forms, we always find as a constant the notion of the state as the intrusion and the manifestation of a higher order, which is then actualized in power. Therefore, every true political unity appears as the embodiment of an idea and a power, thus distinguishing itself from every form of naturalistic association or natural right, but also from every societal aggregation determined by mere social, economic, biological, utilitarian, or eudaimonistic factors. The ancient Roman notion of imperium essentially belonged to the domain of the sacred. This notion, in its specific meaning, even before expressing a system of territorial supranational hegemony, designated the pure power of command, the almost mystical and auctoritas inherent in the one who had the function and quality of a leader, capital L, a leader in the religious and warrior order, as well as in the order of the patrician family and eminently of the state. A power and authority that are not absolute, are not real authority or real power, as de Maistre made clear. Just as in the order of natural causes, likewise in the political domain, it is not possible to regress indefinitely from condition to condition. The series must have its limit in one point, which is characterized by the unconditioned and by an absoluteness in the act of deciding. This will also be the point of stability and of consistency, the natural center of the entire organism. If it lacks this, a political association will be merely an aggregate, an unstable formation. Conversely, the above-mentioned power refers to a transcendent order that alone can ground and legitimize in terms of a sovereign, autonomous, and underived principle that is the basis of every right without being subject to another right. These two aspects and two necessities mutually condition each other in reality. In doing so, they express the nature of the pure political principle of the imperium, and also the figure of the one who, as true leader, must embody and represent it. The juridical view of sovereignty, the so-called state of right, no matter what form it embodies, refers only to a caput mortem, namely the condition proper to a dead political organism, which lives in a mechanical fashion, is characterized by a latency or absence of its center as the original generating force. If order, the form that triumphs over chaos and disorder, thus the law and the right, is the very substance of the state, all this has its sufficient reason and ultimate justification only in the above-mentioned transcendence. Thus it was rightly said, princeps e legibus salutes, namely, the law does not apply to the one who acts as leader, just as Aristotle said concerning those who, being themselves the law, have no law. In particular, the positive essence of the principle's sovereignty has rightfully been recognized in the power of making absolute decisions in exceptional or emergency situations, beyond any duties and discussions, whenever the existing right and laws are suspended or their suspension is required. In such instances and circumstances, one can witness the new arising and manifestation of the absolute power from above, which, though it remain invisible and silent in every other period and at other times, nevertheless should not cease to be present whenever the state remains steady in its generating principle, or wherever the state is a living organism and not a mechanical thing or mere routine. The state is not the expression of society, the basis of sociological positivism, namely the social or communal view of the state, is the index of a regression and naturalistic involution. It contradicts the essence of the true state, inverting every proper relationship. It divests the political dimension of its proper character, original quality, and dignity. The anagogical end, namely the power of a power drawing upward of the state, is thus completely denied. The opposition between the political and the social domains is fundamental. It has the value of a category. The more it is emphasized, the more the state is animated by a metaphysical tension, displaying solid structures and representing the faithful image of a superior type of organism. Only when the tension decreases do differences become attenuated and the group of men gathered around the supra-ordained symbol of sovereignty and authority weakens and crumbles. Only then may that which is a byproduct in an artificial creation, i.e. the nation, becomes autonomous and separate itself, thus acquiring the appearance of a living entity in its own right. Then what emerges is the nation as a people, collectivity, and mass, namely that which such a concept has increasingly signified since the French Revolution. The real difference between then and now lies in the cowardice and servile attitude of those who today no longer have the moral stature of men or of representatives of a higher legitimacy and authority from above. At most, we find what Carlyle referred to when he spoke of a, quote, world of domestics that yearns to be ruled by a pseudo-hero and not by a real master. The essential task ahead requires formulating an adequate doctrine, upholding principles that have been thoroughly studied, and beginning from these, giving birth to an order. This elite differentiating itself on a plane that is defined in terms of spiritual virility, decisiveness, and impersonality, and where every naturalistic bond loses its power and value, will be the bearer of a new principle of a higher authority and sovereignty. It will be able to denounce subversion and demagogy in whatever form they appear, and reverse the downward spiral of the top-level cadres and the irresistible rise to power of the masses. From this elite, as if from a seed, a political organism and an integrated nation will emerge, enjoying the same dignity as the nations created by the great European political tradition. Anything short of this amounts to only a quagmire, dilettantism, irrealism, and obliquity.
Sorry I couldn't shorten the chapter. I felt we had to include all that. But the start of this chapter...
Exceedingly verbose.
The start of this chapter, the justification for Imperium, I felt is extremely necessary for this episode. Not only,
it's a pretty clear articulation of I mean, when you get past the verbosity, it's a pretty complete summary of Evola's view of the state.
Mm-hmm.
You see a lot of it in Revolt Against the Modern World too. He goes, I guess, even further really into the sort of metaphysical principles on which the state should be based.
I think in that he more orientates himself towards the sacred, but this particularly of the necessary of imperium, of this like absency of liberalism is connected to human nature. Liberalism is something that's not natural, and you can see the resultant of such, where instead of a human applying himself to something transcending, it's left to something lower to the physical plane.
And I think you can make the case that liberalism is an inherently materialistic ideology, for all the
no question.
For all the notions of the rights of man, and we hold these truths to be self-evident. It's a mercantile ideology pushed for mercantile interests. The idea of imperium, the idea of the princeps, not only is one of authority, but divine authority, Leto, as you said, and as we've stated previously in other episodes of Kulturkampf, the Roman state, the Republic era, as well as the Imperium, they were religious states, the state being part of the divine order.
Sol Invictus.
Yeah, Sol Invictus, exactly. And it's interesting to note, and this is just sort of a Nick, as you were reading this passage out, it struck to me a historical example. Before the French Revolution, the Ancien regime of France, the king was titled King of France, right? He was king of the state being the functionaries and the people as a whole. After the July Restoration and the very brief rule of the constitutional monarchs of France, the title was purposefully changed to King of the French. So it automatically denotes a sort of democratic function. So that's a
well. Yes, it's the question to Evola. It's a question of on what basis is the state? What is the state based? And the idea of a state based on a people is to him a sort of a liberal inversion. Even if it takes on an anti-democratic quality. It's not just democracy. It's to him, because what happens is when you have a political elite, the ruling elite, that are no longer deriving their purpose from a eternal higher principle, they need to justify their power on an appeal to the people, and that sets in motion a process that goes lower and lower to the masses until you reach things like hardcore communism.
Well, this is a meme that we've been exploring and I've been promulgating, and it's a true meme, is that nationalism in all of its varieties is a product of the Enlightenment. It just is on a historical basis.
To give an analogy, take Donald Trump. The problem here in the American context is, it comes to mind the H.L. Mencken quote is, democracy is a belief that the people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. And the thing about this is, like, yeah, okay, you want populism in the sense that you want the non-urbanite scum to, overthrow the, I guess, Democrats or something. but the thing is like, well, American people, like, their will, the so-called will of the people and what they want, is not going to be able to solve the world situation, because the American people, for instance, would happily, let's say Hezbollah began actually raining rockets on the occupation state of Israel. Well, the American people would be more than thrilled if Donald Trump started nuking them. Even the so-called, even the MAGA people. Like they're not. There's been no significant change here, and the problem is you cannot rely on the people. I mean, this is the fundamental thing with an anti-democratic worldview. Is like the people, they're going to continue looking out for their very short-term interests, and you can't rule an empire based on the whims of the people. Even if you manage to shift the class of people in the American multicultural empire, if you manage to somehow shift the class to the white working, the class of quote the people to the white working class, you're not going to solve this problem.
As much as it is like, kind of nice to view it as like a brotherly kind of movement and something, every movement needs like a leader. Otherwise, it's bound to just fail automatically.
I mean, and here he is referencing Carlyle. Is that not, like, does this not fit Donald Trump? A world of domestics that yearns to be ruled by a pseudo-hero?
Yep.
I mean, it fits it to a T.
Yeah, it does.
Another thing that was left out of this already very long and verbose passage was
Just read the whole chapter.
This concept of the idea as the fatherland. And this is something that is not going to jive well with sort of run-of-the-mill white nationalists, because he's explicitly criticizing the idea of a state run. Here he says, I'm looking at what you put up here. I'm not digging through to the later part, which I'm referring to, but right here at the very beginning, he says, therefore every true political unity appears as the embodiment of an idea and a power, thus distinguishing itself from every form of naturalistic association or natural right, and also from every societal aggregation determined by mere social, economic, biological, utilitarian, or eudaimonistic factors. So here he's criticizing the idea that you can base a true state, among other formulations, on the biological, on race, exactly. To him, the true basis of sort of the ruling order is going to need to be an idea. It's going to need to be an idea that is specifically derived from, again, these eternal principles. And without that, you don't have the true imperium, the true organic state. These are naturalistic associations.
Everything after that is kind of like a continuation of that, but it's kind of to a lesser degree, and eventually an involution of what it is till something that's still completely foreign and degraded compared to those principles.
Exactly. And so again, it's something very divorced from the concerns, even not just of the sort of American masses, but of American dissidents too. I mean, it's a far stretch, I think, to get people to think in these terms. And I think there's a part here too where he says, effectively what he's saying is like the fish doesn't know the water he swims in. I forget the exact quote. And as it is with tradition, like these are like these integral traditions that are transmitted through forms of the imperium and the elite, etc., aren't really things that they're things you take for granted, right? And if you aren't swimming in that water to begin with, then the water is definitely a very foreign thing. Does that make sense as a stretched analogy?
Yeah, coming from, we're going to continually relate to America, but coming from a point where you're basically taught in school the left, not even liberalism, and then trying to come from a point where you turn to the right and it's something that is viewed as left by Evola.
Yeah, exactly.
It's completely
right.
No, not fit for swimming in water, swimming in foreign water, moving from salt to fresh.
Yeah. Well, any thoughts on that, gentlemen, before we move to the next section?
No, go ahead. Just checking. We are recording, correct?
Yeah, I believe so. Want to be sure. Yep, looks like it. Looks like it is. We'll edit that. We'll make sure to edit this out. All right. So, continuing onward, we have the next chapter: the feminine and masculine aegis. The state is under the masculine. I just want to make sure it's aegis or is it aegis?
Aegis.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was aegis.
All right, I'll start that over again. So continuing, we'll be discussing the next section, the feminine and masculine aegis. The state is under the masculine aegis, while society, and by extension the people, or demos, are under the feminine aegis. Once again, this is a primordial truth. The maternal domination, from which the political virile principle subtracts itself, was also understood as the domination of Mother Earth and the mothers of life and fertility, under whose power and tutelage existence was believed to unfold in its physical, biological, and collective material aspects. The common mythological background is that of the duality of the luminous and heavenly deities, who are the gods of the political and heroic world on one hand, and the feminine and the maternal deities of naturalistic existence, who were loved by the plebeian strata of society on the other hand. Thus, even in the ancient Roman world, the idea of state and imperium, i.e. of sacred authority, was strictly connected to the symbolic cult of the virile deities of heaven, of light and the super-world, in opposition to the dark region of the mothers and of the chthonic deities. The same ideal line runs through the themes found in primitive societies, i.e. the Mannerbund, up to the central, bright motif of the Olympian state tradition of the classical world and the several superior Indo-European civilizations. Later on in history, this line leads, if not to the imperium, to the divine right of kings, where there were no group created by the power of a right. There were orders, aristocracies, political classes defined by disciplines and dignities that cannot be reduced to social values and economic factors. Then the line was broken, and the decadence of the state idea, parallel to the denegregation and obfuscation of the pure principle of sovereignty and authority, ended with the inversion through which the world of the demos and the materialized masses emerged on the political horizon, engaging in the struggle for power. Such is the primary meaning of any democracy in the original sense of the term, and of every kind of socialism. In their essence, they are both anti-state, and represent the degradation and contamination of the political principle. Both democracy and socialism ratify the shift from the masculine to the feminine, and from the spiritual to the material and the promiscuous. This is an involution, and the basis of counterpart, of which is an involution occurring within the individual himself, expressed by the inner triumph of faculties and interests connected to the naturalistic, obtuse, and merely vitalistic part of human being. According to the correspondences already acknowledged by Plato and Aristotle, injustice, namely, the distortion and external collective subversion, always reflects the internal subversion, that which is present in a given human type that has prevailed in a given civilization.
So this chapter has similarities to the mother of civilization in our previous episode.
Mm-hmm.
But it's less concerned with the sacred and just the overall relation between masculine and feminine. He kind of uses it as a word to describe anything which, like something which is opposed to his order as feminine automatically. There's only like two. There's either black and white with him. One is an involution and one is a positive. But something particularly unique is namely the distortion and external collective subversion always reflects the internal subversion, that which is present in a given human type and prevailed in a given civilization. So it's not just something relating to the civilization or the monarchy or the government at the time. It's relating to the actual people. It's more than something just political. In my view, that's what he's trying to espouse in this paragraph. If there's nothing we said, we can move on. There is quite a few chapters we have to read through.
Well, Nick, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, okay. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I would things he doesn't like accord to the feminine principle or the lunar. However, there is a consistency there, namely that if the foundation of the true solar imperium is that of the manor bund, or principles of loyalty as honor as loyalty among men, then I mean you can understand this when you start identifying these sort of feminine calls for the interests of the people and things like that. Is you're no longer ruling in this sort of disinterested, distanced way as representatives of this manly order. But you can see his logic here. It is a bit. If you read enough Evola, this is definitely the stuff that keeps popping up over and over again.
Well, and there is that. I mean, it is worth noting there is a very stark differentiation between what one could consider to be a sort of noble detachment and the, what do you sort of say, like the mother principle, basically, the idea that a state should be caring instead of leading. I really, I'm not entirely sure a state can be both at the same time. I think I do think that there's truth to that. I think a state's primary function is either to lead the people through authority, through imperium, or to comfort them and to placate them, and that can be, those are masculine and feminine traits, certainly.
Yeah, I think they kind of sometimes can be like a yin yang between them, more so on the like masculine part. It just, I'm pretty sure people already know this, but he's talking about like not like a female person, the female archetype of what is the actualization of something female.
Yeah, Leno.
Maybe give an intro into the transition, though.
Yeah. 3. Oh yeah, Leno, you go.
Yeah, you count me down.
What's up?
You count me down.
All right, 3, 2, 1.
Liberalism. The beginning of this disintegration of the traditional socio-political structures, or at least whatever was left of them in Europe, occurred through liberalism. Following the stormy and demonic period of the French Revolution, the principles espoused by the Revolution first began to act under the guise of liberalism. Thus, liberalism is the original of the various interconnected forms of global subversion. It is therefore necessary to expose the errors of which the ideology is based, and especially those of the immortal principles by which it is inspired. This is necessary not only from a doctrinal point of view, but also from a practical one. Nowadays, the intellectual confusion has reached such an extent that liberalism, which according to the ancient regimes and the Church was synonymous with the anti-traditional and revolution, is portrayed by some as a right-wing movement, then bent on protecting human dignity, rights, and freedom against Marxism and totalitarianism. The following considerations are aimed at exposing this misconception. The essence of liberalism is individualism. The basis of its error is to mistake the notion of a person with that of an individual and to claim for the latter. Unconditionally and according to egalitarian premises, some values that should rather be attributed solely to the former and then only conditionally. Because of this transportation, these values are transformed into errors, or into something absurd and harmful. Let us begin with the egalitarian premise. It is necessary to state from the outset that the immutable principle of equality is sheer nonsense. There is no need to comment on the inequality of human beings from a naturalistic point of view. And yet the champions of egalitarianism make equality a matter of principle, claiming that while human beings are not equal de facto, they are so de jure. They are unequal, and yet they should not be. Inequality is unfair. The merit of the superiority of the liberal idea allegedly consists of not taking it into account, overcoming it, and acknowledging the same dignity in every man. Democracy, too, shares the belief in the fundamental equality of anything that appears to be human. Second, the contradiction lies in the principle of sufficient reason, which is expressed in these terms. For everything, there must be some reason why it is one thing and not another. Now, a being that is totally equal to another would lack sufficient reason. It would be just a meaningless duplicate. From both perspectives, it is rationally well established that the many not only cannot be equal, but also must not be equal. Inequality is true de facto, only because it is true de jure, and it is only because it is necessary. That which the egalitarian ideology wishes to portray as a state of justice is in reality a state of injustice, according to a perspective that is higher and beyond the humanitarian and democratic rhetorics. Conversely, to posit inequality means to transcend quantity and omit quality. It is here that the two notions of an individual and the person are differentiated. The individual may be conceived only as an atomic unit or as a mere number in a reign of quantity. In absolute terms, it is a mere fiction and an abstraction. The will to equality is one and the same with the will to what is formless. Every egalitarian ideology is a barometric index of a certain climate of degeneration, or the trademark of forces leading to the process of degeneration. Overall, this is how we should think about the noble idea and the immortal principle, quote-unquote, of equality. We should note in passing the irrationalism of the so-called utilitarian sociology, which could have been valued only a society of merchants. In this doctrine, the useful in quotations is regarded as the positive foundation of every social political institution. Burke saying that every political system that presupposes the existence of heroic virtues and of higher dispositions leads to vice and corruption is not so much an index of cynicism, but instead a short-sightedness about knowledge of the human species.
A daily reminder that not everything with a face is human.
And daily reminder also, John Stuart Mill was a hack and a fraud. So,
well, here you have some stuff that I like. Even he seems to be at pains to have to go over something so simple. It's like, no.
But even more prevalent in our society currently. It was prevalent within the baby boomers, but our generation, it's getting.
I don't remember, again, because we read a section out of this, if this is the same chapter in which he addresses the fact that this was not fully sincere, this move for equality. It was more of a weapon directed against the established aristocratic order. Because it's so stupid that, people capable of overthrowing the aristocratic order are not dumb enough to really believe this stuff.
That was definitely on Carlyle's view. I'm trying to find if Evola had the same views.
It's a thread that rings totally true. Like the Eurocrats ruining Europe don't really believe that a mud person with an IQ of 80 is on the same level as them. I mean, it's all about gaining political power.
Liberals are the true inegalitarians.
Don't say that.
But I mean, he lays out basically, so liberalism was used to level the old aristocratic order, and that paved way for Marxism to attack the what remained, which was the bourgeois.
Liberalism seemed, it equated basically.
That's why it was the first evil, because it kicked the throne out, and then from there you had all this opening for further class warfare.
But just saying that we were going to say that's threaded by evil people. I wouldn't say people like John Stuart Mill and Burke were particularly evil people. As he said, short-sightedness knowledge of the human species.
Well, Evola was certainly no fan of Burke.
No.
He mentions Burke in this book.
Although I see liberalism something something of a degeneration of just the removal of a government just to facilitate rights among people. It's something not correct.
Well,
but it was kind of further turned into something much more decadent through Marxism over the modern age.
Well, just in terms of Burke and Mill, again, we're harping on the point, but when you're operating within a system where imperium and the divine right of kings doesn't exist, then one automatically, an individual with individuals with Burke and Mill were brilliant men. They had to operate under the basis of utilitarianism. what other option is there? It's sort of the logical conclusion to all of this, and it's kind of the main critique of liberalism, and sort of the main critique of that individuals, even on the dissident right, have of sort of the racist liberal, right? Is, well, it's just, one step forward and two steps back. If you're operating under a system of liberalism, if you're operating under a system of utilitarianism, then communism and sort of the anarcho fetishizing of rights and of minorities, it's the logical end step to all of this. You can't be an individualist and not expect social justice warriors. They come hand in hand.
This is where he gets into the. He mentioned briefly in the passage that Leto read the idea of what is useful to society, and you're right that people like Mill were. I mean, there's a very I hesitate to say brilliant thinker, but I mean, there's no denying his influence, and he's a heavy hitter. All right, you can say that. But yes, the idea is, okay, well, what's a metric? And this is something that he gets from his mentor René Guénon, which is this contrast between the reign of quantity and the reign of quality. And liberalism is sort of the harbinger of the reign of quantity, because if man is equal, if man's value is, if you have value inherently by simply being born, then all men have this value. Well, there's not much to distinguish. So now you have, so like if you wanted to measure, for instance, like a tragedy, right? Well, okay, well, here's one for you guys. What's worse, the hanging of the nine or Rwandans hacking each other to death with machetes? I mean, a lot of Rwandans left and chopped up pieces on the side of the road, but I don't have any crocodile tears for that.
No.
I don't think anyone listening to this does.
No.
And furthermore, I also don't think any New York Times readers actually do. Even though, of course, they want to say that they're all bent up about this, they don't actually do anything.
Right.
I mean, the thing is ultimately pretty absurd, but usefulness becomes, okay, well, here are our units in society. How do we direct these towards max? And this is where you get someone like John Rawls from.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like that differentiation between the Rwandas and the nine. That could be related to like a relationship of like a race, like biological. Like, would you say the same thing for, say, like some quality of person in some like Eastern country like India or China or something over like some quantity people within the US? Would you say the same thing?
Personally, I mean, I would need some specifics to make a moral judgment, but I could, to give you another example, take the massacre in the Katyn forest. This was, you had I mean, it wasn't that many people who were killed. I believe it was 1,500 or so, something like that.
I think so. Yeah.
But this was the cream of the crop of society. So if you have a scale of values that identifies quality, I mean, this is far, and it had a lasting. I mean, it's a bunch of peasants being slaughtered and a bunch of aristocrats being slaughtered would, in theory, be a different thing, assuming the aristocrats were actually aristocratic, were actually the best of society.
Mm.
Otherwise, I mean, you're left with you see it. This is common, like pop culture. There's all kinds of. It's a very common question, like, would you save X or like have a million people die or whatever? You see it show up in that Batman movie with that stupid scene with the boats.
Yeah, well, you even have what's that? Because I actually just thought of the moral dilemma that was espoused in. It's Woody Allen's Bullets Over Broadway. It's if you had a family trapped in a burning house, and that house also had the last copy of Shakespeare, what would you save? And you can only save one. What would you save? That's quality over quantity right there.
You guys have seen that like train thing as well with the
Yeah.
that thing.
Oh, the train movie with the snow and the
No.
Oh, the comic.
It's like
Where it's you have
I was
to
thinking
kill one person,
Snowpiercer.
like kill one person or kill five or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is his again. Like this goes back to Gagnon, and you have a lot. There's individualism has with itself an inherent leveling quality, because when you start placing the individual as the ends, then you also no longer have a metric for quality itself, because quality would be determined by superpersonal values and people's ability to serve those values. So now you end up with, if each individual is the end, well, then it's what's best for the mass of individuals. And yeah, you go right back to Mills type thinking. How do we maximize the utils? How do we maximize happiness? And then you end up with John Rawls. I mean, you read that guy? You guys read that stuff at all?
no, I'm familiar.
Well, Rawls posits, like Rawls' great thought experiment. He posits, okay, well, imagine that you exist behind this sort of blank starting point, this veil of ignorance, and you don't know where you're going to end up. Like, you're going to have society on the other side of this veil, on the other side of this curtain. You're going to have society, and so you'll end up somewhere. You may be, I don't know, a Negro basketball player, or a poor white dairy farmer or something. Whatever it is you may be, you don't know going in. So what kind of like mechanism would you want to decide this? Like, according to Rawls, what you want is the fairest possible mechanism, because you yourself are going to end up here, and you yourself want to maximize your chances of not being a pauper or a bum or what have you. And so his whole what was the book? It's like the ethics of or justice, something to that effect. On justice, I don't know.
A theory of justice?
Theory of justice, I believe it is. Yeah, that's right. So, and this is diametrically opposed to Evola, and we'll get into that in the next chapter here. I'm about to read bits from, but Evola has the more the classical idea of justice as to rendering to someone what it is they deserve by their station, by their relation to the higher orders. That's what is just, is to render what they deserve. And to Rawls, justice would of course just be fairness, and to achieve a just society is to maximize fairness, which is to level distinctions between people. Like if the ultimate endpoint of Rawls would be that all inherent advantages would be handicapped, and all the handicapped would be somehow elevated. There was a Kurt Vonnegut story, I don't know if you guys read, where like if you're too smart, it's a little short story. It's like if you're too smart, they put like a electric chip in your brain, and if you're doing too much of that big brain nibba stuff, it starts to shock you. You're getting a little too smart. That's where all this leads. It's these crazy egalitarian schemes for how it is that we can maximize fairness. It's a total perversion of justice. It's a perversion of the fundamental values of civilization, really.
Well,
and so here.
Feminine.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking into this John Rawls character, and it looks like the prevailing thought here is that his theory of justice actually came to him when he was stationed in post-war Japan, and he sort of witnessed the American occupation and sort of deconstruction of traditional Japanese society. So it's a that's a terrifying origin story for any political philosophy.
People from the so-called right-wing capitalist liberal faction, again, quote unquote right wing, in the American tradition, like they want to see someone like Rawls as this aberration, some kind of perversion of liberalism, because liberalism to them, like the individualism, is a inherently unequal thing. You see this, I mean, it's popular in the dissident right. A lot of people are fans of the libertarian economist Hans Hermann Hoppe. And this is, I've been meaning to work on a piece on this, specifically Evolian criticism of Hoppe, because Hoppe's he has the same idea of like a natural elite, but this natural elite would be, because again, it's okay. So if you have individuals in the basis of your order is individualism. Well, what's the measure of quality?
Right.
Well, in this case, the measure of quality is your success as a capitalist. And those are the people who then in turn should rule society. The natural elite are then the people who are best at marshaling production,
at predatory finance and
predatory finance.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, Hoppe won't admit it, but the reality of his scheme is a little enclaves, little sort of feudal enclaves ruled by Jews.
Yeah. It's terrifying.
Evola would definitely designate that as like the rule of the merchants of this, like the doctrine.
Oh yeah,
like
no question about
something
it.
we're living in currently.
Yeah,
I think, to praise Hoppe a little bit, I think he's a bit more realistic than something like Atlas Shrugged. Ayn Rand, like he kind of understands it better. And
he's a shrewd thinker, but the problem is he's ultimately dogmatic.
Yeah, that's the point.
Never part with his capitalism, and it's not going to happen, because I mean that's another subject really. But point being is here Evola is identifying contrast between a rule of quality and a rule of quantity. He gets that from Gagnon, and we can move from there into his comments on this flows completely into it, personality, freedom, and hierarchy. It's really on the same page. So here's from Evola. The dignity of the human person, with everything that this expression entails, and around which the supporters of the doctrine of natural law and liberals rally, should be acknowledged where it truly exists, and not in everybody. And even where this dignity truly exists, it should not be regarded as equal in every instance. This dignity admits different degrees. Thus, justice means to attribute to each and every one of these degrees a different right and a different freedom. The differentiation of right and the hierarchical idea in general derives from the very notion of a person, since this notion, as we have seen, is inconceivable without referring to the difference, to the form, and to the differentiating individuation. Freedom must be understood and defended in the same qualitative and differentiated manner as the notion of person. Everybody enjoys the freedom he deserves, which is measured by the stature and dignity of his person, or by his function, and not by the abstract and elementary fact of merely being a, quote, human being or a citizen. Thus, according to the classical saying,
libertas sumis infamisque aquando.
Freedom ought to be equally distributed above and below. It has been rightly remarked that, quote, there is not one freedom but many freedoms. There is no general, abstract freedom, but there are articulated freedoms conform to one's own nature. Man must not generate within himself the idea of a homogeneous liberty, but rather that of the whole of such differentiated and qualified liberties. The other freedom, which is upheld by libertarianism and by natural law, is a fiction, just like the idea of equality. The perfection of the human being is the end to which every healthy social institution must be subordinated, and it must be promoted as much as possible. This perfection must be conceived on the basis of a process of individuation and of progressive differentiation. In this regard, we must consider the view expressed by Paul de Lagarde, which can be expressed approximately in these terms. Everything that is under the aegis of humanitarianism, the doctrine of natural law, and a collectivity corresponds to the inferior dimension. Merely being a man is a minus compared to being a man belonging to a given nation and society. This in turn is still a minus compared with being a, quote, person, a quality that implies the shift to a plane that is higher than the merely naturalistic and social one.
So here we have like an argument against like natural rights and just kind of libertarianism in general, rights which are just given to the sake of someone being a person instead of someone by either through their ancestry or by their own merit in a way.
Well, to be specific to Evola, being an individual, because he draws the distinction between an individual and a person. And this is back to what we were just saying about the distinction between quantity and quality. An individual is a unit, whereas a person is completely unique. They have their own attributes, and in fact, the goal of as he's saying, the goal of a healthy social order is basically the actualization of the highest possibilities of that person, of their natural qualities, and taking into account, of course, their limitations as well. So the person thrives in a class-based hierarchical society ruled by a imperial sun cult. Whereas the individual is something that thrives in basically a market-dominated liberal society. I guess put thrives in big quotes there.
Yeah.
The individual is a creature of that society is probably the better way to put it.
While the individual may have more freedoms, it's not necessary. It's something lesser. It's something that's going to degrade the human, as we all know. Something he talked about. Do you have something?
Yeah, well, I would add, with freedom, because this is a chapter where he focuses on this idea of freedom and personhood, etc. Freedom is similarly, his conception of freedom is basically the kind of the mirror. Maybe you could say it's the positive mirror of the conception of justice. So where, even though you could, I guess, make a case for justice in the same frame, but they're of a similar nature in his thinking. Basically, you maximize the freedom of to maximize the freedom of a person is to create an environment in which that person can fulfill their highest nature. That's what freedom is, right?
I think I gave an example in the last episode compared to letting a child free into the world compared to that of a father figure. Bringing that child up and then allowing him to have the freedom.
That's a perfect
to actualize himself.
Perfect example. Yeah, no, that's exactly what he's getting at, because he's criticized what he criticizes in this chapter. It wasn't in the part I just read, but he explicitly criticizes the negative conception of freedom, i.e., the liberal conception of freedom, and which is the American conception of freedom, wherein it doesn't matter what you choose to do. The good part, the relevant part, is the fact that you're able to choose to do it. So if you want to go to a fag club and get anally sodomized by 60 different guys, well, it's a lot better than living in Iran, bucko. Jordan Peterson.
Well, it's enshrined in our it's enshrined in our founding document.
No, but
the idea.
But I'm not just joking. That's actually
true.
The premise is that it's better to be able to be anally sodomized than to have someone telling you that you cannot be anally sodomized. And so the conservative, the right-wing American liberal will say, well, we don't want you to be anally sodomized, but we're also not going to restrict your right to do it.
Right.
Whereas the true freedom is to, there should be nothing, it shouldn't be seen as freedom for man to debase himself in that kind of way. It's not freedom.
No, it's degradation.
No.
So we shouldn't. There's an extent to which we should not abandon freedom as it's not, the concept of freedom itself is not necessarily the problem. It's the negative conception of freedom. We want people to have freedom.
Not espousing, going full, over the top fascism where we dictate every part. You need individuals within society. It's kind of like the example exactly what you've been espousing, the father figure. I try to relate it to.
Sure.
But something we mentioned in the previous section, the differentiation between the individual and the person. I've kind of read through this thinking of he's trying to give an example of the rhetoric used by the left to kind of push the idea within the demos of the idea that man is like an atomic unit. It's not, you are devoid of all personality, all traits, all affirmation. All the government should be doing is providing you with, as you said, your rights. And the only way this ideology can exist is if you like degrade the person to that point where it is just a unit. It is just like a measurement. It is no longer like, as he says, a person with traits, a person with a characteristic, a person that is something beyond the individual.
Welcome to our current age, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if the individual is the end, then that means the individual is the scale. The individual himself decides the scale of values.
Yes. Well, yeah.
So,
yeah.
From the perspective of the state, from the perspective of the broader order, what you would want to do is to maximize that individual's ability to select from the buffet of values.
Right.
There's no standard here. There's no standard of quality.
Or even worse, the standard of quality is an inherently sort of materialistic conception of it, right? If the human being is nothing but a unit of capital, then that unit of capital, that sort of atomized individual, is only judged and based on its usefulness if he can acquire the most goods. So
that's the technocratic viewpoint.
Yeah.
We're all equal under nihilism.
But again, that's a conflation of quality and quantity.
Right.
Because now your measurement of the individual is how much, how big of numbers can I get out of him? And how many others do I have at my disposal?
This will relate to when we get into militarism, but do you want to move into the next chapter?
Yeah. Well, as we just sort of passed over the technocratic explanation of the Bugman, let's get into the antithesis of that, which is the
that's a good point. The bug we should add the Bugman is a perfect description of the man of quantity.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't thought about that. That's good.
Well, it's also, and I was thinking about the Bugman in terms of, I mean, it is funny because, like, Evola speaking about sort of the effeminized society. It is interesting that these people do not only behave woman in a feminine manner, but sort of take up the soy meme is more or less is dead because it's been picked up by everyone, but they do take on sort of feminine attributes, just namely man tits and the like.
They have a way of sort of like just deconstructing masculinity as well. I know this is a tangent, but it's something worse than just being feminine.
Well, it's I think I think they're more or less threatened by it because it isn't a isn't a view based on comfort and pleasure. It's a
how is a Bugman's worth determined? No, but it's how he serves the hive.
Yes, yeah.
It's how he serves the hive, and that's why he's a Bugman, is because in serving the hive, he hopes to be given the things that he wants. Namely pussy, gadgets, and I don't know, Rick and Morty. I don't know what are they.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a pretty good approximation of what these fucking people live for. Sad. All right. Well, let's continue. Let's continue on. It's the virile quality of the superior being. In this context, what will be paramount is the virile quality of him who, in the case of conflict between opposite needs, knows how to assert the right of given principles and a given law over that which belongs to the naturalistic and material realm, whether in his case or that of others. Thus, family bonds or specific affections will not limit such a person, nor will he be guided by the mere notions of utility and well-being. even if these notions were defined in social and collective terms. The personality is realized and consolidated along the path of the special asceticism, required by freedom, understood in his way, namely, by inner freedom, and control over oneself as a physical individual. Likewise, the foundations of the hierarchical connections proper to that which can be rightly called, quote-unquote, the natural right of heroic peoples, unquote, are not to be sought elsewhere. The first of these foundations is that the measure of what one can demand from others is dictated by the measure of what can demand from oneself. He who does not have the capacity to dominate himself and to give himself a code to abide by would not know how to dominate others according to justice, or how to give them a law to follow. The second foundation is the idea, previously upheld by Plato, that those who cannot be their own masters should not find a master outside of themselves, since practicing the discipline of obeying should teach these people how to master their own selves. Thus, through loyalty to those who present themselves as representatives of an idea, and as the living approximations to a higher human type, they will remain as faithful as possible to their best nature. Superiority and power need to come hand in hand, as long as we remember that power is based on superiority and not vice versa, and that superiority is connected with qualities that have always been thought by most people to constitute the true foundation of others' attempt to explain in terms of brutal, quote-unquote, natural selection. Ancient primitive man essentially obeyed not the strongest members of society, but those in whom he perceived a saturation of mana, i.e., a sacred energy and life force, and who, for this reason, seemed to him best qualified to perform activities usually precluded to others. To depend on such leaders constituted not only subjugation, but rather the elevation of the person. This, however, makes no sense to the defenders of the, quote, immortal principles, unquote, and to the supporters of human dignity, because of their obtuseness. It is only the presence of superior individuals that bestows on a multitude of beings and on a symptom of disciples. Excuse me. I'm going to start that over again. It is only the presence of superior individuals that bestows on a multitude of beings and on a system of disciplines of material life a meaning and a justification they previously lacked. It is the inferior who needs the superior, and not the other way around. The inferior never lives a fuller life than when he feels his existence is subsumed in a greater order endowed with a center. Then he feels like a man standing before leaders of men and experiences the pride of serving as a free man in his proper station.
This is again something very alien to America.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that... Yep, go ahead, Leto.
Kind of like, I think it's always there, but it's just orientated in a way towards capitalism, like the entrepreneur, which is kind of like a very degrading way of looking at it, but it's what society sees as this superior human being.
Well,
it's like such a...
Yeah, the entrepreneur definitely is the American conception of the aristocrat, right? It's the
but he doesn't beg to be ruled by them. He would prefer himself to not. He would say that this is a great man who has succeeded, but he would never admit that person is an oligarch and builds power over them.
It comes to my point, like, I don't think he mentioned it here, but someone has to be orientated towards something, like what he would see as the superior is some like form of tradition or some solar masculine way of conceiving the world within a culture. Without that, which is how he kind of gets, I think, some of his conflicts with Nietzsche and other philosophers, is it has to be connected with this tradition. Otherwise, it is bound to decline, or in some cases, just degenerate into something pathetic.
Well, and with it's a good point, because with Nietzsche, the extent to which, I mean, he wasn't a political philosopher, and for that matter, I guess really neither was Evola. This is among his most political books, probably his most political. Metaphysics of War, to a certain extent, was written in a very political context. But with Nietzsche, it might be a crude formulation, but you could say that like purpose of society is to produce superior men. And Evola has almost a more altruistic, totalizing view, wherein the superior man is sort of the rock on which society itself is built.
And that there will always be inferior men, and that they need direction.
Right. Well, they need. It's not even just a paternalism. Like, it's that the horizons, like the possibilities of their lives, are increased by virtue of belonging to this order.
Yeah.
Not necessary, like the word necessary, not to mean like like something that is kind of. Sorry, I'm having trouble defining it. You go on.
Well, I was just going to point. He gives a criticism of this. I don't know, like I'm not an anthropologist, or I couldn't tell you like the true. I mean, the origins of the state is something that's been disputed. I mean, there's been many states, many rises and falls, but here he does dispute to a certain extent, at least from a metaphysical perspective, and somewhat anthropological too, the idea of it's just the raw strength that prevails and constitutes the elite. And I mean, this is where he says, primitive man essentially obeyed not the strongest members of society, but those in whom he perceived a saturation of mana. And so there's definitely, I don't really want to debate sort of the anthropological basis of that, but it should be said about civilization itself, like a more advanced civilization, that once you go beyond the primitive, that is true in the sense that the people who rule are not necessarily the literal strongest members, because now you have civilization.
Right.
There's other things that determine who's on top, but that the people respect something more than just raw strength. And he gets into this when he talks about Machiavelli too, but it's better to be sort of feared than loved, but that's also not ideal.
Mm-hmm.
I think that people can respect an order that they can themselves perceive as superior.
Right.
It's not just that it's imposed. There's sort of a cynical liberal myth that societies were never run by superior men. It was just by the force of the club that they were to be thought of as superior. But this obviously isn't true.
On the word necessary, not necessary as in it's necessary to affirm like the demos or the lower plebeian parts of society. It's necessary as in the cases the lower strands will always exist and they have to be orientated in a positive way.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I can go on here. This is where he gets into questions of quote, totalitarianism and the organic state. So he says, one of the catchphrases that have become a rallying cry in the intellectual confusion of our contemporaries is anti-totalitarianism. This catchphrase is employed mostly by democracies. The reference point that is upheld is basically the confused and formless view of the individual's freedom. In this formula, many different things are lumped together, as is shown by the distinction expressed in very primitive terms between a, quote, right-wing and a, quote, left-wing totalitarianism. But in the above-mentioned currents, it is clear that quite often totalitarianism is only a pretext, just as communists and socialists find it useful and agreeable to brand anybody and anything that does not agree with their ideology with the label of fascism. Likewise, the confusion about totalitarianism is employed in a tactical fashion by various parties in democratic regimes, and is exploited in order to try to discredit and to portray the traditional view of the true state in a heinous way. To put an end to this misunderstanding, it will be helpful to introduce a fundamental distinction between the totalitarian state and the organic state. The idea of the organic state was not born yesterday. This needs to be recalled both for those who have forgotten it and for those whose intellectual horizons are restricted to the polemics between fascism and anti-fascism, as if nothing else ever existed previously in history. The idea of the organic state is a traditional one, and thus we can say that every true state has always had a certain organic character. A state is organic when it has a center, and the center is an idea that shapes the various domains of life in an efficacious way. It is organic when it ignores the division and the autonomization of the particular, and when, by virtue of a system of hierarchical participation, every part within its relative autonomy performs its own function and enjoys an intimate connection with the whole. In an organic state, we can speak of a whole, namely something integral and spiritually unitary that articulates and unfolds itself, rather than a sum of elements within an aggregate, characterized by a disorderly clash of interests. The state that developed in the geographical areas of the great civilizations, whether they were empires, monarchies, aristocratic republics, or city-states, at their peak were almost without exception this type. A central idea, a symbol of sovereignty with a corresponding positive principle of authority, was their foundation and animating force. Almost as if thanks to a spontaneous gravitation, men and social bodies found themselves working in synergy. Though they retained their autonomy, they undertook activities that converged towards the same fundamental direction. Even contrasts and antitheses had their part in the economy of the whole. As they did not have the character of disorderly parts, they did not question the superordained unity of the organism, but rather acted as a dynamic and vivifying factor. Even the opposition of the early British parliamentary system was able to reflect a similar meaning. It was called, quote, His Majesty's Most Loyal Opposition, though it disappeared in the later party-ruled parliamentary regime. However, totalitarianism merely represents the counterfeited image of the organic ideal. It is a system in which unity is imposed from the outside, not naturally acknowledged, but rather through direct forms of intervention and control exercised by a power that is exclusively and materially political, imposing itself as the ultimate reason for the system. Moreover, in totalitarianism, we usually find tendency towards uniformity and intolerance of a particular form of autonomy and any degree of freedom. For any immediate body between the center and the periphery, between the peak and the bottom of the social pyramid. Totalitarianism, though it reacts against individualism and social atomism, brings a final end to the devastation of what may still survive in a society from the previous organic phase. Quality, articulated forms, castes and classes, the values of personality, true freedom, daring, and responsible initiative, and heroic feats.
So this chapter is kind of necessary for the distinction between fascism and traditionalism, portrayed in like an organic versus totalitarian state.
Well, this is what I wanted to bring up, because clearly, and I do think Evola is referring to fascism here and not sort of Stalinism and communism and authoritarian communism. But I do take issue with the final passage specifically, that it brings a final end to sort of the organic phase of society. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, gentlemen, but the use of totalitarianism was that exactly, which was a tool to bring about a reflourishing of the organic state.
My thoughts exactly. It was something like you can't just impose an organic society on an already degraded one.
Exactly.
You need something else, something that was used within a certain time period, which was the fascist, especially within Italy, the fascist revolution. But I kind of see his reasoning behind the degradation of the individual, kind of like how everyone has to conform to something, like everyone has to conform to like a national fascist state, where really the best individuals typically come out of something where they're given a bit more freedom than like it depends. It isn't like clear cut. Like there are levels of totalitarianism. But I think you're right on the point that I don't agree with Evola as in it was something bad or wrong. I think Mussolini and Hitler in ways took the necessary steps within their time period.
Well, one of the things one of the things that Evola said in his critique of fascism was that, in a proper fascistic nation, you won't need a party. It's just the nation or the state itself would be able to organize and work without the inner functionaries. Well, you need to get to that point, right? You can't just.
Okay, there's a couple things going on here. So when you say party, that's correct. He views party. So if take for instance formulation, he talks about it of one party state. Well, one party state implies that there is some opposition, that they have a faction, and that goes against you have to. So when he's talking about totalitarianism, first part of it is he is addressing a straw man of the left, or of the liberal, more specifically, in that they characterize these things as totalitarianism. And he says, it wasn't in this part that was read, but he says, okay, well, I'm going to just take their definition at its word and address that. But also there is his storied relationship to Italian fascism as well as to German National Socialism, which you can read about in his he wrote 2 books on exactly those questions. But in a certain sense, you might say the problem is that it's not totalitarian enough for him. It's not integral enough. It's not so he's not, his criticism here of totalitarianism is not the totalizing element, the fact of a social order that's derived from the political elite, the true aristocratic elite that represent the immortal principles, the true immortal eternal values, et cetera, et cetera. That, I mean, looking at this from a perspective of someone who isn't this hermetic, metaphysical right-wing absolutist, he would of course be accused of totalitarianism as to what he wants. He's not satisfied because he's talking about the imposition of a particular faction of the society and using this force to attain that. He wants something that is total and smooth and organic, that encompasses everything, and it derives from these principles on down low, and everything is in harmony in this sense. All the classes and castes of the society are all in this totalizing harmony.
Totalitarian, definitely from our point of view, not so from his. But on the Italian fascism and the party, Nick's exactly right. The fact that Mussolini just didn't come into power, and instead of saying we're the Italian fascist party, instead of just saying we are Italy, or we're the aristocracy of Italy, there was kind of a distinction between the party and Italy where there shouldn't have been one in Evola's view.
Exactly correct.
Well,
that's exact.
I have to.
Exactly his criticism.
I have to ask though, but how does it even work? On a practical level.
Well, this is the problem with Evola across the board, dude. And especially for American readers, it's okay, well, how does this fit in exactly? I mean, Evola doesn't really you see him hitting on Carl Schmitt a little bit. I think that Schmitt is pretty clear influence in some of this conception of sovereignty. I mean, he gives basically Schmitt's definition of sovereignty, and he identifies that of the dictatorship and of the emergency state,
rule of exception,
rule by the exception, as a temporary measure, etc., but that is also defining of the quality of a sovereign itself, that it could initiate those measures. But for the most part, Evola is not a very good basis for understanding politics in the modern world. I mean, he's a really brilliant thinker, and there's a lot you can learn from reading him and studying him. But as far as if you're looking for practical considerations, No,
look elsewhere.
but at the same time, you should learn from Evola.
Yeah.
Like if you're looking for practical considerations, you're also probably doing something wrong, because I mean, what are you going to do if you don't have the basis? If you don't have the sort of spiritual, like, to his mind, I can't really totally disagree with this. Like, if you don't have that elite cadre that has the right guiding principle to rule, well, you're never going to end up with, if you have like high ideals for what you want for the new order, you're never going to get that without it being implemented by people who would at least approach Evola's standards.
Right.
So I mean, there's certain things you can't really get around. Like, he is ultimately right that, like, I mean, and with the Third Reich, like, there were undoubtedly men who were of a very high nature, but it should be said there were also gangster types,
Yeah.
especially in the early years.
Goering, yeah.
I mean, you can't ignore that,
Yeah.
and that's why he was far more impressed with the SS than any other aspect. And even less so with it. I mean, Italy, you can imagine, I mean, it's being Italian himself that he has these criticisms of this modernist regime that it's not exactly hitting all of his boxes.
No.
It isn't good enough.
Yeah, it's not good enough for him.
I think, that line especially covered the definition well enough for our viewers, and it's necessary for Evola's thought. But do you want me to read the next paragraph?
Yeah.
Bonapartism, Machiavellianism, and elitism. Bonapartism may be regarded as the extreme consequence rather than the antithesis of democracy. Bonapartism represents a deposition based on a democratic view, which it denies de facto while fulfilling it in theory. Burnham, in his Machiavellians, has correctly identified Bonapartism as a general tendency of our modern age. In this trend, new forms of government to speak and to act on behalf of them. And since he personifies the will of the people, which is conceived as the political ultima ratio, the leader ends up claiming for himself an unlimited authority and regarding all the intermediate political bodies and all the branches of government as completely dependent on the central power, which alone is believed to legitimately represent the people. Regimes of this type are often legalized democratically through the technique of the plebiscite. Once this happens, the formula of the people's self-government or similar formulas, the will of the nation, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the will of the revolution, are employed to destroy or ultimately to restrict those individual rights and those particular freedoms that were originally associated with the idea of democracy. Thus, Burnham noted that, theoretically speaking, the Bonapartist leader may be considered the perfect embodiment of the democratic type. In his despotism, it is as if the omnipotent people led and disciplined themselves. Modern autocracies are created at the sound of the hymns to the workers and to the people, or to the nation. Thus, according to Burnham, the century of the people's state, and the classless society, and National Socialism are euphemisms or cover-ups, the only and real meaning of which is the century of Bonapartism. It is rather evident that when the trend gains momentum and the political structures are stabilized, totalitarianism is the direct and final result. There is a substantial difference between the adhesion on which a political system of a warrior, heroic, or feudal type is based, the foundation of which is both sacred and spiritual, and the adhesion found in movements led by a tribune of the people, a dictator, or of a Bonapartist leader. In the latter case, which I regard as negative, the leader appeals to the lowest and almost pre-personal levels of human beings, flatters them, manipulates them, and makes sure that any higher sensibility is stifled by them. This is also a reason that the leader presents himself as in a democratic manner, as a son of the people, and not as the embodiment of a higher humanity and the bearer of a higher principle. Thus, this phenomenon has a regressive character. Insofar as the values of the personality are concerned, the single individual these collective movements or systems is restricted not so much in this or that exterior freedom, which is, after all, of little consequence, but rather in the inner freedom, the ability to free himself from his lowest instincts, which, as I've said, the general climate tends to foster, elevate, and flatter.
Yeah, he's referring to James Burnham and the former ex-communist who wrote The Machiavellians, Defenders of Freedom, which is a very interesting book. He also wrote Managerial Revolution. I think I was talking to you guys before the recording about this a little bit, but Burnham, as far as they go, is probably one of the, as far as 20th century figures of the American right, he probably has more in common with the European right than most. You might attribute that to his previous Marxism, being certain anti-capitalist tendencies, but I find it interesting that he was reading Burnham. Here what you have is this idea that, like, okay, you can't really classify totalitarianism, dictatorship, it's as a left or right thing by its form alone. Because both they appeal to the people, right? And so he goes on to describe Napoleon as sort of the, he creates an empire, but it was the fulfillment of the principles of the revolution itself. Right. So here he uses Bonapartism as a way to describe it's an absolute politic of a certain sort, but it's derived still. Again, you always got to go back to the basis on which the state and the ruling elite are founded. That's what he's always looking at, and that's what he won't be satisfied with, because it's not going to be established on the correct principles. So anytime you appeal to the people or the will of the people, the benefit of the people, etc., you are dealing with liberalism turned into dictatorship so Bonapartism.
It's a very
like authoritarian enlightenment is still part of the Enlightenment, right?
Have you guys ever read, as a American writer, James Kolb, who wrote a book, The Tyranny of Liberalism?
No, I have not.
He's a paleocon.
I've heard of it, but I've not read it.
It's a good book. I would recommend it. I mean, I'm trying to remember where in the book he describes this. It might be in this chapter, but he explains why it is that liberalism leads to this progressive devolution, because each time you have to appeal to like baser and baser, lower and lower interests and demands of the people on which to base your state. I thought pretty insightful observation. I mean, because you arrive, I mean, again, in America, you have this just ongoing, endless, and very annoying and gay debate about what is the true liberalism, right? And this is, you get the American, so-called American right, which I guess is effectively libertarians, claiming that, the modern kind of mainstream salon or what have you, like that they're socialists and therefore they're anti-liberals and that they're the true liberals. We're the classical liberals, or, blah 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 blah.
Against Israel as well.
Yeah.
Well, it boils down to, like, the American sort of debate about true liberalism always boils down to one's view of capital and capitalism. That's
that, and also one's view of freedom.
Oh yeah, well and
because that's the key thing is like these people also say that they're acting in the name of liberty because they want to make sure that Tyrone has his Mercedes.
Right.
Like if Tyrone doesn't have a Mercedes, this is an injustice, right? Because he's not being given a chance at freedom. I mean, it's really easy to go, and this is what they bemoan. The American right bemoans this fact that this tension between positive and negative liberty.
It's not what's the meme that they always trot out? It's not the equality of outcomes, but the equality of opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. No, and that's what the American. Yeah. You could effectively, like, it may be kind of crude, but you could, to a certain extent, you could say that the American left and the American right is a debate between positive and negative liberties. And the American right claims that positive liberties are, socialist and evil and foreign and non-American. And I'm of the opinion that positive liberties are the natural outcome, and would be Evola's. He doesn't address this question exactly in the sort of American context that we're dealing with it, but his thinking definitely leads to it, which is that, that neat distinction between, the sovereign individual. There's no reason to uphold this. And if the end goal again is the individual, then why not make sure that Tyrone gets a Mercedes? How is that unjust? We're just trying to expand freedom.
Yeah. And it is interesting too. You mentioned, Nick, that as things sort of collapse and as the masses sort of cry out for more basic sort of needs, like security, for instance, or even more. I think probably the lowest would be just not being executed. You have the rise of the Napoleon, right? Who was, Napoleon is an interesting figure, and maybe we could speak about him. Go into a little tangent about Napoleon as emperor, because he in a lot
kind of funny. He basically says on the political front, Napoleon is expressive of liberalism and the values of the evil revolution, et cetera, et cetera. But as a military commander, can't fault him.
Yeah.
That's basically what he says.
And it is interesting because he is Napoleon as a figure is in a lot of ways very contradictory, because you do have, and I do definitely think that there is that competing conflict within Napoleon. I think is emphasized in his revolutionary Jacobinism versus his sort of soldier sort of code of honor and conduct. I think that's sort of
That's exactly what Evola identifies, and from Evola's perspective, it's actually makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is not a lot of contradiction in the sense that, well, here's a guy capable of creating empire. Here's a guy who can command loyalty, who can win on the battlefield, etc. But where is the basis of his power? How did he rise to power? Well, he rose to power on the principles and the milieu and the chaos of the French Revolution.
Right.
He is quite a bit of like an absolutist. If I recall, when we're reading Carlyle, he specifies like a similar view of history, but he kind of sees Napoleon had an opportunity to do something better. Like it wasn't destined to become a failure. Where Evola, like any relation to something liberal is an automatic failure. Any willing to the people is.
There was that film too from 30s or 20s. If you see it now, it's like a 3-panel thing. It's
what is that?
It's quite long. But that's considered to be like a fascist film. I don't know. You tell me.
Is it actually fascist, or is it fascist from our modern interpretation?
It does have explicit fascist undertones. I'll say this. This is the 1927 biography of Napoleon. This is by Abel Grants, and it is exceptionally long. I think the running time is over 300 minutes. But it is a very impressive piece of early cinema.
A side note, Kubrick always wanted to make a Napoleon film.
Oh.
Got around to it. Closest you're gonna get there is Barry Lyndon. But yeah, no, we're good on the Bonapartism. I mean, it basically just because you consolidate society under some sort of leader, or you have a strong centralizing authoritarianism, again, you're back to Evola's always his main question is, well, what are the principles on which this state is founded?
Right.
And he sees it as I mean, and it's ultimately true that, like, the reason I brought up James Kolb's work earlier, I mean, we're living right now. I mean, it drives you insane, really. I mean, it's here to just psychologically and eventually physically torture us all to death, and it's this contradiction between, oh, you know, you're all free individuals, da 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 da, but, you know, make the say the wrong thing and we'll economically ruin you. Take it a little further and we're going to send you to a sodomy dungeon. So beneath the mask of the you know, humanitarian and liberal mask is an iron fist, and it will fucking kill you. And more to the sort of big political question, it's also totalizing. It's absolute. It sees anywhere in the world that doesn't, you know, that they have an interest in, that doesn't abide by the proper principles, as a target to be brought to heel through bombs and American soldiers.
Moving on from discussing the demonic nature of the United States, let's discuss the demonic nature of the economy. Nowadays, it is possible to speak of a demonic nature of the economy, because in both individual and collective life, the economic factor is the most important, real, and decisive one. Moreover, the tendency to converge every value and interest on the economic and productive plane is not perceived by Western man as an unprecedented aberration, but instead as something normal and natural, and not as an eventual necessity, but as something that must be accepted, willed, developed, and praised. As I have said before, when the right and primacy of interests higher than those of the socio-economic plane are not upheld, there is no hierarchy, and even if there is one, it is only a counterfeit. This is also true when a higher authority is not accorded to those men, groups, and bodies representing and defending these values and interests. In this case, an economic era is already, by definition, a fundamentally anarchical and anti-hierarchical era. It represents a subversion of the normal order. The materialization, and the soullessness of all the domains of life that characterize it divest of any higher meaning all those problems and conflicts that are regarded as important within it. This subversive character is found both in Marxism and its apparent nemesis, modern capitalism. Thus, it is absurd and deplorable for those who pretend to represent the political right to fail to leave the dark and small circle that is determined by the demonic power of the economy, a circle including capitalism, Marxism, and all intermediate economic degrees. Nothing is more evident than that modern capitalism is just as subversive as Marxism. The materialistic view of life on which both systems are based is identical. Both of their ideals are qualitatively identical, including the premises connected to a world the center of which is constituted of technology, science, production, productivity, and consumption. And as we only talk about economic classes, profit, salaries, and production, and as long as we believe that real human progress is determined by a particular system of distribution of wealth and goods, and that, generally speaking, human progress is measured by a degree of wealth and indigence, then we are not even close to what is essential, even though new theories beyond Marxism and capitalism might be formulated. The starting point should be, instead, a firm rejection of the principle formulated by Marxism, which summarizes the entire subversion at work today. The economy is our destiny. We must declare in an uncompromising way that in a normal civilization, the economy and economic interests understood as the satisfaction of material needs and their more or less artificial appendices have always played and will be played a subordinated function. We must also uphold that beyond the economic sphere An order of higher political, spiritual, and heroic values has to emerge, an order that neither knows nor tolerates merely economic classes and does not know the division between capitalists and proletarians. An order solely in terms of which are to be defined the things worth living and dying for. We must also uphold the need for a true hierarchy and for different dignitaries, with a higher function and power installed at the top, namely the imperium. I dispute the superiority and the rights of a merely economic class living in a materialistic fashion. From Evola's pen to God's ear.
Well, the main thing I would say about this is, the dispute, ultimately, like any pretensions about communism having this idealistic basis are mute, because the great dispute between, the alleged dispute between communism and capitalism was really just a question of what can deliver the goods. And communism lost. And now you have,
as Evola says, appeal to the masses.
Right. And so why would the masses be content starving and having to, eat their shoes when they can
watch MTV and have abortions? Well, yeah. They had abortions in Soviet Union. I guess it's what would be better.
I mean, if it's a question, it's funny too, because we look at the Cold War dialectics. I mean, these were things that the USSR claimed. Mm-hmm. That was the early claim, that they were the workers' utopia, and that they were able to deliver on these material questions, that they were able to provide for people in a way that the capitalist West had people just dying in the streets, when the inverse is true. I mean, not to say that there's not certain economic injustice in the capitalist West, but it's nothing compared to people actually starving to death on the Volga by the millions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a dispute. And so that's why communism failed, and that's why cultural Marxism and capitalism have blended together to create the Zog ideology we deal with today. Because you can deliver materially, you can subvert everything that matters, elevate the most shit-tier human beings, and suppress the people who could otherwise be doing something better.
Well, and the joke is played on the true remaining ideologues of communism. You get all your Marxism, but it doesn't turn into a communist utopia. It turns into a better consumer.
I can't believe those people still exist, because you would think that they would just all become libertarians.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that like old school communists exist, I just have a hard time even accepting that this is true. I guess it's true, but it's like, I mean, what do you guys find? I mean, you no longer have any material complaints.
Yeah.
I mean, you could say, yeah, we want more stuff.
Well, that is what it boils down to, right? It's we need to achieve automation so no one has to work ever. So the proletariat becomes the bourgeoisie, even though we want to kill all the bourgeoisie. It's a strange. Yeah, it was a shitty ideology back then. It's even worse now, to be perfectly honest.
A lot of ideologies find this this ideological need implementation of the economy, but don't really consider the reality of such things. It's a very common thing with libertarianism and capitalism. And that's why exactly Evola is saying we're going to step over. We're going beyond the economy. The economy is subordinate to us. We're not going to lower ourselves to this idea of money is the subversion, the use, the means to an end for everything. It's just,
well, and
it is what it is.
This is something that I'm for all of our sort of particular criticisms of the current dissident right, I do think this is something that the vast majority of us have totally adopted, in that economic matters are at least, or rather at best, a tertiary concern. That this is, first and foremost, either if you're religious, it's a spiritual conflict, and then there's a cultural one, and the importance are levied on those two factors correctly.
Well, we're not satisfied. There's definitely a point in which people like to leverage sort of the concerns of the white working class
as sort of aping the communists and hoping that he'll achieve similar political success. But I think ultimately,
I think that is largely strategic, though. Like
Yeah, I mean, it also isn't going to, in my opinion, it's not going to get us anywhere. Maybe it's a starting point for recruitment, but those exact claims are not really where this is. Because here's the thing. It's like, and this is, if I can read on the next segment too after I say this if y'all like, but it's the question about, it's not enough. The demand shouldn't be that people are, because there are certain places people point to in the country that, to be honest, I'm not personally familiar with, like Appalachia and areas of the South in which like white poverty is very significant, and pair that with the opioid stuff, etc. You hear a lot of talk about this. But the demand is not just that people be given material satisfaction, that they be given the opportunity to work. The real demand is that work have meaning, and that work be a part of something that gives purpose to people's lives. We don't just want to give people jobs in fucking widget factories. That's not the goal.
And it's not how you it's not how you cure. You don't cure sort of Marxist critique of capitalism, namely sort of the alienation that it produces. You don't cure that by giving everyone material goods. You give them meaning, and you can't distill meaning. You really can't distill meaning from a new PlayStation or a new car. You just can't.
Well, and this is what he says. This is what Evola has to say about work. He says,
I was just going to mention one thing.
Sure.
Just concerning the strategic use of like that rhetoric towards like a worker's fair pay and so on and so forth. I think that was a lot more prevalent in his time compared to our time, where people have come to like kind of okay with the situation and kind of just go day by day, where it was a bit more different in the 1950s, definitely.
Well, I will add too that considering like the process of production and automation and stuff, from a more socialist perspective, you very well could have these things operate in a way in which people don't actually need to do a lot of work and could have, basic income guarantees. I know a lot of people are not going to be happy with me saying that, but you absolutely could, considering like we're not living in the Industrial Revolution. You don't need a bunch of people screwing the widgets on.
And automation is an inevitability at this point.
And they will put people out of work, and so there needs to be a way to, assuming we're not dealing with, road war.
Right.
All right, I'll just go get off my socialist tangents. Here's what Evola says about work: is we should not forget that the law, meaning, and sufficient reason for these structures have always consisted in references for man to something beyond himself and beyond economy, wealth, or material poverty. All these things have only a secondary importance. Thus, it can be legitimately be claimed that the so-called improvement of social conditions should be regarded not as a good, but as evil. When the price consists of the enslavement of single individuals to the productive mechanism and to the social conglomerate, or in the degradation of the state to, quote, state based on work, and the degradation of society to, quote, consumer society, or the elimination of every qualitative hierarchy, or in the atrophy of every spiritual sensibility and every heroic attitude. Hegel wrote, quote, happiness is not to be found in the history of the world in the sense of material comfort and social prosperity. Even the few happy periods found here and there are like white pages. But even at an individual level, the qualities that matter most in man and make him who he is often arise in harsh circumstances, and even in conditions of indigence and injustice, since they represent a challenge to him, testing his spirit. What a sad contrast it is when the human animal is granted a maximum of comfort, an equal share in the mindless and bovine happiness, an easy and comfortable life filled with gadgets, radio and TV programs, planes, Hollywood, sports arenas, and popular culture at the level of Reader's Digest. Again, spiritual values and higher degrees of human perfection have nothing to do with either the presence or the absence of socioeconomic prosperity. The notion that indigence is always a source of abjection and vice, and that advanced social conditions represent its opposite, is the fairy tale told by materialistic ideologies, which contradict themselves when they uphold the other myth, according to which the good guys are on the side of the people and the oppressed workers, and all the bad guys are to be found on the side of the wealthy classes, which are corrupt and exploitative. The fundamental idea was that work was not meant to bind man, but to free him and allow him to allow the pursuit of worthier interests. Once the demands of existence were satisfied, no economic value was cherished enough to sacrifice one's independence to it, nor was the quest for the means of subsistence deemed worthy to consume one's entire life. Overall, the above-mentioned truth was acknowledged that human progress must be defined not on economic and social level, but rather on an inner place. In other words, progress does not consist in leaving behind one's ranks to become a successful or an increasing amount of work in order to gain a position that one is not qualified for. The limit of this devastation consists of the inner situation out of which the forms of industrial capitalism have developed. Here, the activity aimed at profit and at production has turned from a means to an end, ensnaring man's heart and soul, condemning him to a non-stop race and an unlimited growth of frantic activity and production. Here I want to recall Nietzsche's words as a parting shot regarding the social question. Quote, "The workers shall live one day as the bourgeois do now, but above them, distinguished by their freedom from wants, the higher caste, that is to say, poorer and simpler, but in the possession of power."
Definitely the relation to America is within this chapter, and will be throughout all his critiques of the economy. But yeah, his main point is the fundamental of work not being something that completely becomes the meaning of existence. Going to work every day wasn't something traditionally what it was. It was just outside of work you had something which you want to do, some like calling to nature, some talent you wish to pursue, and the work was just a means of obtaining that monetary, so you could continue that existence. I kind of see that as the change from this is like an implementation of the American ideology, as work now has to be your goal. It is something that, because you are forced to work 5 days a week and so on and so forth, it's not something that can be no longer considered a minor activity in your life. It becomes something so obtuse it can't be ignored.
Well, this gets into what we could consider as the totality of Evola's worldview, in that work wasn't just work. Work was organic. It was filled with the organic, and it actually had and distilled meaning. And we can sort of go all the way back to feudal Europe, right, where the serfs, the peasants, were not only tied to their local church, they're not only tied to their local lord or baron, but they were tied to their community, and with that community they worked, and subsistence living, but there was meaning to that.
Well, take the example of a street sweeper.
Right.
So in an Evolian traditional context, well, the street sweeper is performing a role in society, that this is something that he invests his spirit into, is a vocation for him. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's on the lower ends of society, but it's accorded honor. And the difference between that and the Americanist capitalist order is, when they say a street sweeper is good, when they say a toilet cleaner is good. In fact, okay, I used to hear this analogy when I was talking about communism, that the problem with communism is that people cleaning toilets get paid the same as people doing X. Now, if you were to ask me, like, well, what is actually more important than cleaning toilets?
Right.
Like, well, what stockbroker? So the stockbroker is deserving of this money, whereas like the street sweeper is not. Well, it may be true that there's a certain technical problem you have to work out in which, people on performing more complicated, higher functions.
It still boils down to utility, though.
Well, the measurement, they say, and similar in America, okay, well, it's better to be, it's more honorable to be I hesitate to say honorable. It's better to be a street sweeper than to be a welfare Laquanda. But why? Well, the street sweeper is making money. That's why, because he's doing work and making money, and that's what makes him valuable. No, the true way to accord to a street sweeper is to understand that he's performing a valuable function as a part of a whole.
Right.
And that has honor and dignity in it. It's not that, he just sweats and therefore is given money and that somehow is valuable. That's part of what Evola's getting at too. So work on its own accord is not. What's so great? No, who likes work?
Yeah.
Who's Evola to be like? Evola has never swept the streets. He was he came from an aristocratic family, but he's similarly not one to besmirch people who are participating in the whole, who are doing things that maybe are beneath his sort of qualifications.
Laboring, but with meaning behind it.
Yeah. Right.
Just one last thing on the final Nietzsche quote. I think it definitely has some truth to it, to the point of where what should be at the top hierarchy under subordinated.
Well, I'm also reminded of Spengler's Marxism is the capitalism of the lower classes. It's a way of getting what they want materially.
Yeah.
So we'll move into military style, militarism, and war. The fight against militarism has been one of democracy's favourite rallying cries. This formula was associated with a hypothetical pacifism and with the attempt to legitimise the just war, which was conceived merely in terms of a necessary international police operation against an aggressor. The view of modern democracies that first emerged in England under the aegis of mercantilism is that in society the primary element is the bourgeoisie type and the bourgeoisie life during times of peace. Such a life is dominated by the physical concern for safety, well-being, and material wealth, with the cultivation of letters and the arts serving as a decorative frame. Thus, according to the view, the civilian or bourgeoisie element is usually, and as a matter of principle, entrusted with running the state. In this view, the military and warrior element has the subordinated meaning of a mere instrument. It should have no particular influence or exercise any interference whatsoever in daily social life. Even if it is acknowledged that the military element has its own code of ethics, it is not desirable that this code be applied to the normal overall life of a nation. The view I am referring to is closely associated to the humanitarian liberal beliefs that the true civilization has nothing to do with that tragic necessity and useless carnage called war, that a true civilization's foundations are not the warrior, but the civic and social virtues inspired by the immortal principle, and that culture and spirituality are expressed in the world of thought, the sciences and the arts, while everything that is related to war and military matters amounts to brute strength, to something materialistic and soulless. According to the most recent formulation of the corresponding ideology, armies should be used only as an international police force to maintain the peace. In most cases, this amounts to allowing wealthy nations to live undisturbed. Traditional man yearn to fight this battle and to triumph in both the inner and outer worlds. A true and just war on the external plane reproduced in other terms the same struggle that has had to be waged within. It was a struggle against forces and people that in the external world presented the same traits as the powers the single individual needed to subjugate and dominate internally, until a triumph was achieved. From this follows an interdependence between the warrior idea and that of a certain asceticism. Inner discipline and superiority toward or control of oneself that appears in various degrees is the best warrior's traditions and remains on the military plane in the specific sense of the term, with the authentic value of a culture in the anti-intellectualist sense of development and mastery of oneself. Contrary to what the bourgeoisie and liberal polemics claim, the warrior idea may not be reduced to materialism, nor is it synonymous with the exaltation of the brute use of strength and destructive violence. Rather, the calm, conscious, and planned development of the inner being and a code of ethics, love of distance, hierarchy, order, the faculty of subordinating the emotional and individualistic element of oneself to higher goals and principles, especially in the name of honor and duty, these are all elements of the warrior ideal, and they act as the foundation of a specific style that has largely been lost. This loss occurred with the shift from the states that are regarded as militaristic, in which all this corresponded to a long and stern tradition, to the democratic and nationalistic states, in which the duty of serving the armed forces has replaced the right to bear arms. Thus, the real antithesis is not between the spiritual values and culture, on the other hand, and materialistic materialism on the other. The antithesis is between two ways of conceiving what spirit and culture really are. We must resolutely oppose the democratic bourgeoisie and humanistic view of the 19th century, which, in correspondence with the advent of the inferior human type, has presented its interpretation as the only legitimate and unquestionable one.
Yeah, I'm immediately reminded. Evola talks about, when he's talking about things he actually likes, which are of course few and far between, he praises the sort of the origins of of Germany, of the Teutonic Knights, the Order of Teutonic Knights. He also praises the Knights Templar, but here you have something that is founded on a certain kind of militarism, chivalry, things that Evola would approve of, and it should be noted that society, Germany in particular, was far less warlike than England.
Yeah.
So if people, recoil at this, well, you're praising, war for its own sake and what? No, it's the warrior code and the warrior ethics and a society in which this idea is given its proper place. It's not like wanton murder and destruction for materialistic reasons like you have in the case of the British Empire, which was far more brutal and far more imperialistic and aggressive.
But also against the American imperialism of democracy in a way as well. It's both regimes are fundamentally not traditionally orientated, and therefore the spreading of something degenerative on the rest of the world.
Mercantile systems, man. They're patient zero for everything.
Well, it was incredibly prophetic for him to say, he's describing the hypocrisy of this formula was associated with a hypocritical pacifism with the attempt to legitimize the just war, which conceived merely in terms of a necessary international police operation against an aggressor. And that's the liberal formulation of war, because the opponent, again, is a criminal. They're not, an equal who you have a dispute about and you're going to settle this on the battlefield.
No, they're evil.
No, they're a lecherous. They're criminal, and that's always how it's framed. I mean, this is to me like this was the thing that always set me personally against America and the American Empire. This is the hypocrisy I could never abide with, which is this, all these platitudes about human rights and democracy, and they just slaughter people endlessly, and you have no clear reason or purpose to this. And by the way, they're slaughtering people who are far less materially equipped. They don't, they're doing it with drones and with F-16s and battleships and all kinds of technological equipment against some guys with AK-47s and maybe if they're lucky some shoes.
Yeah,
it's hard for me. I mean, you got the racial element, but it's kind of hard for me to be sympathetic to Americans in a foreign land killing these people who've done nothing to them.
I mean, maybe if it was, like an equal combat, it would maybe there'd be something more honorable to it, but no.
Well, it isn't combat. It just sort of devolves into killing, you know?
Extermination.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's oppression.
Yeah.
It's imperialism and oppression of the ugliest and most hypocritical variety.
Yeah.
It's disgusting. There's no. Yet at the same time, like there is, I mean, people. This is why the you have films and things that appeal to people's sense of American men, their sense of. I mean, this is something ingrained into men, and so they need something to base this on. They need to see like some kind of the myth is usually, well, it's about the guy next to you.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. It's like, but why don't you and the guy next to you stop? Like, what are you doing, guy? Shut the fuck up, pussy. I'm sorry. Like again, I hate to always do this, but I just stop, guys. Stop joining Zog. Stop it. Fucking stop. I won't say anything more.
No, it's honestly, man, it's a point that's worth talking about. And I don't know, like when you bring up just sort of.
But I think
What's up?
I was going to say, I think Evola, when he's mentioning this particular like inversion of war, yes, that's true. But Evola is also particularly alluding to like, the combat experience of the warrior has also been degraded from that. Like, if this like meaning behind it, if you're fighting for Zog, not only is it meaningless, it's also like, it's just degrading when you're killing humans in that type of sense and you aren't given the opportunity for a triumphant struggle. It's
Well, yeah, we've lost.
and this
We talked about this with Junger in previous episodes. We've lost sort of the ideal. We have the differentiation between a soldier and a warrior, right? A warrior, there's no function for a warrior really anymore. Not when you can drone, a city full of people. All you need is a guy, and you don't even need a soldier for that. All you need is some technician, some middle managing functionary to press a button.
And I think it's inevitably connected to what Nick was saying, but also to do with the advent of like machinery, like just the modern age. I think maybe like we'll have to just theorize, but something like heroic could come out of like a war which was more dominated by machinery than. Well, I don't know.
Well, I see.
It wouldn't definitely in the epoch of like nuclear war. It definitely doesn't.
No, but I think a modern sort of mechanized. I think that the more technologically sort of advanced a system or a function of the state or even the state itself becomes, there's the critical need for like a warrior ethos or just an ethos, a heroic ethos, is multiplied, because making any sort of function easier, whether it be killing someone, for instance, or making money, you need to have a proper grounded worldview to sort of direct it and to keep it from spiraling out of control.
Yeah, I mean, you can see more of Evola's view on this if you read Metaphysics of War, which I mentioned this, I joined you for your Junger episode, and I gave my similar polemic against joining Zog, but the thing is, it's like that impulse, it's always going to be there. Man wants he wants to win honor and glory through struggle. But in my personal opinion, like this is an age which requires a higher degree of critical thinking, especially from an American perspective. And then this, I guess I might as well good enough time as any. Like this is what I would say about applying Evola to America. It's because we do not have the transmission of this integral tradition or memory of it. Because again, our American memory begins with the Great Break from Mother, or I shouldn't say Mother. Evola would have a big problem with
the fatherland.
Mother Europe.
Yeah.
Well, even that's like too feminine, you know. He gets into that, but regardless, the source,
yeah.
right? The source of the old political order of the old civilization. The American founding myth is the break from that, right? Well, when you look, we don't have that connection to it, and so we have to ask ourselves, well, okay, if we agree, and I think we should agree that this is how you do high civilization. Evola is correct about the true foundation of what high civilization looks like. He gives no relevant blueprint to how you come about that out of the ashes of the American abomination. I would personally say the starting point, there's two key aspects of the starting point from the American perspective, and that would be the part that Evola would easily prescribe, which would be the basis of a Mannerbund, of a society of men based on in which honor is based on loyalty to one another, and a willingness of those men to do what is needed with respect to their enemies and to arrive as barbarians and conquerors to this degenerate hellscape, I think would be step one. But in the process of that, you also need critical thinking, which, you know, from the perspective of maybe this esoteric metaphysics, like, rationalism, you know, you can't, empiricism, scientism. Yeah, you're going to get really bogged down. You're going to end up like spending your life in a library. I would say you need a kind of a shrewd, street smart, critical thinking, and that would be, certain values are very, very much eternal values and true values, but don't whore yourself out with this stuff. Don't think just because that's how it should be that you need to provide that even when there's no appropriate outlet. So don't think, I want to be a warrior. I'm going to join the U.S. military. And I'm not just saying that in the context of, well, you shouldn't join JOG, which you shouldn't, but in all other aspects too. You know, it's you got to use your head in a way. Like, we are left on our own here. We are out in the wilderness, and we have no reference point, and we have to start from scratch, which may be pretty bleak prospects for our future. But that's my 2 cents.
That would be a great Tales from the Trough segment. Just an embodiment of Evola in like the modern world, just like ivory tower warrior just coming out of the basement.
It's like Don Quixote. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
You know, you embrace like the heroic ideals, and like, I don't know, 10 minutes later you find yourself in fucking Quantico.
He embraces the heroic ideals and rams his car into the nearest Starbucks.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like from a spiritual perspective, it's like,
it's true.
Fucking rock and roll, bro. But from a critical thinking perspective, it's like, okay, what have you accomplished? And now you're fucked. So like, there's not, you know, you can't just like wholesale apply these values, like because this is the thing, like the kind of society that Evola, and this is kind of tangent, but the kind of society in which the civilization in which Evola is talking about, like a civilization in which these values are given their proper place. Well, we don't live in it.
Yeah.
And that's part of the point actually of Don Quixote, of the novel. It's like when you try to live these values, and I mean, you end up a taxi driver.
Yeah.
Like that, and that's the tragedy. You can't just blame yourself and say, I haven't lived up to this. It's because you're not going to get anywhere on those values alone. Sadly,
yeah,
it's the reality. You have to be shrewd too. You have to be cynical.
And you have to compartmentalize to a degree.
That's why I think someone like Evola would just be happy to write America off as something that doesn't exist, because trying to face these problems from the American perspective, like, it's not about capital T tradition. It's about capital S survival.
Yeah.
Sorry to say.
That's a good point.
So, sorry for the tangent, guys.
That was good, man. It was great.
Communism, realism,
Yeah.
anti-bourgeois.
Yeah.
With it.
Whose turn is it?
All right. I was about to go, but you can go.
Go for it, man. All yours.
All right. Okay, here we go. So one of the reasons we see some intellectuals sympathizing today with communism, which is paradoxical, and it is well known that communism harbors contempt towards intellectuals, is related to the anti-bourgeois stance communism has assumed. Among other things, communism claims to represent the overcoming of the bourgeois era and to lead mankind toward a new realism, beyond subjectivism, individualism, the cult of the ego, and the various types of idealist rhetoric. The materialist and exclusively economic plane on which communism contextualizes these issues is not recognized. They are likely to exercise a certain power of suggestion on the intellectuals. A bourgeois mentality and spirit, with its conformism, psychological and romantic appendices, moralism, and concerns for a petty, safe existence in which a fundamental materialism finds its compensation and sentimentality in the rhetoric of the great humanitarian and democratic words. All this has only an artificial, peripheral, and precarious life. No matter how resolutely it survives due to the inertia and the wide social strata of many countries of the free world. Therefore, I claim that to react in the name of the idols, the lifestyle, and the mediocre values of the bourgeois world, as is the case with the great majority of modern supporters of, quote, law and order, means the battle is lost from the start. However, there's a second possibility to that of the Marxist path. One may conceive a realistic view and a struggle against the bourgeois spirit, individualism, and false idealism that is more radical than the struggle waged against them by the left, and yet oriented upward, not downward. As I've said in the previous chapter, this different possibility is contingent upon a revival of the heroic and aristocratic values when they assumed naturally and clearly without rhetoric or pomposity. In retrospect, typical aspects of Roman and Germanic Roman world have already exemplified it. It is possible to keep distance from everything that has only a human and especially a subjectivist character, to feel contempt for bourgeois conformism and petty selfishness and moralism, to embody the state of an impersonal activity, to prefer what is essential and real in a higher sense, free from the trappings of sentimentalism and from pseudo-intellectual superstructures. And yet, all this must be done remaining upright, feeling the presence of life, of that which leads beyond life, drawing from the precise norms of behavior and action. As far as the president is concerned, with rare exceptions, the average Italian communist is nothing but a bourgeois who takes to the streets. Lenin himself said that a proletarian left to himself tends to become a bourgeois. Just as a false Christian and a member of the Christian Democratic Party represents nothing more than the bourgeois in the temple. Even those who call themselves monarchists can only conceive of a bourgeois king. Interesting. The worst evil for Italy is the bourgeois priest, the bourgeois worker, the bourgeois noble, the bourgeois intellectual. This type is inconsistent, a substance without form, in which there is no above and no below. The watchword or rallying cry should be, wipe the state clean. Only by following this dictum will the shift towards the wrong direction be averted. There is a third possible reference point beyond both intellectualism and anti-intellectualism, a worldview. A worldview is based not on books, but on an inner form and a sensibility endowed with an innate rather than acquired character. It is essentially a disposition and an attitude instead of a culture or a theory. A disposition and an attitude that do not merely concern the mental domain, but also affect the domain of feelings and of the will, forge one's character, and manifest themselves in reactions, having the same instinctive certainty, giving evidence of a sure meaning of life. Usually, a worldview, rather than being an individual's affair, proceeds from a tradition and it is the organic effect of forces that have shaped a certain type of civilization. At the same time, from the subject's perspective, the worldview manifests itself as a sort of inner race and an existential structure. In every civilization but the modern one, it was a worldview and not a culture that permeated the various strata of society. Where culture and conceptual thought were present, they never enjoyed primacy, for their function was a simple, expressive means and organs in the service of the worldview.
So we kind of have a differentiation from the anti-bourgeoisie stance of like a communist, and as he would see it, a right-wing perspective of anti-bourgeoisie thinking. But the two examples he gives, I don't think are really that relevant today. Kind of, it was more of a when communism was becoming something more prevalent, especially when the Soviet Union still existed compared to that of today. Today's left isn't anti-bourgeoisie; it is bourgeoisie fully implemented, as it says in that Lenin quote.
Leto, as you said, the quote about Lenin, and I'm just going to say here, the proletarian left to himself tends to become a bourgeois. I'm not entirely sure if that's true or not. And certainly he is.
What is a proletarian other than like what are the values of a proletarian other than that of an envy of the bourgeoisie?
Right.
And that, I mean, that's like Lenin's not wrong. Like this is the whole thing with communism and Leninism. It's like the proletarian, it's not like they're interested in securing a place for proletarianism. Their aspirations are to be bourgeois. I mean, to the varying degrees of willingness to admit that. And then, I mean, obviously in America, you have, in the modern day, you have these people who they LARP as proletarians. These they're rich kids, and they talk about fucking workers' revolution. I don't really think that there's like a reason we should give much treatment to that because it's just gay.
No, the limited interactions that I have with the what we would consider them, the new old left, right? The Jacobin mag, careerist publishing house, New York urbanite Maoists. I don't know. I don't really see them at all to be interesting or, I don't know, challenging or really anything. So it is interesting to note that Evola's critique of the bourgeoisie from the right isn't concerned with, as sort of you said, Nick, sort of a knee-jerk response to communism, or rather being against communism in the first place. But it isn't out of any sort of ideological or deep sort of conception against the auspices of communism. It's purely out of a need for survival, right? It's to save their own skin. This is why the Buckleyites, hated the 68ers in America, right? This wasn't out of any sort of real, true love, I would wager at least, out of the from the market, but to save their own skins. Sort of, it's a post hoc rationalization of a defense of liberty and a defense against communism.
Yep. I would like to get your two guys' opinions. Would you agree with both with Lenin and Evola in this case, where he states that the proletariat left to himself tends to become bourgeoisie no matter what? I'm guessing maybe this quote might have been taken out of context in like a reference to capitalism or something. But I tend to agree without any totalitarianism or any state like overshadowing that naturally the proletariat wants to become the bourgeoisie.
Nick, you want to go?
Sure, yeah. I would. Okay, so I would say there is no such thing as like proletarian values. The organizing principle of Marxism of the proletarian was envy of the bourgeois. So I don't. I would. Lenin knows his scheme better than anyone, and he's right. He knows what these people are all about. He knows what these people he's amassing for this revolution, what they really want. Given the chance, they would become bourgeoisie, which is why you need to have endless purges stamping out counter-revolution. I mean, I would say yes. I would agree that because when you base, and Evola would agree with this, when you base this political struggle as revolution on a material quest for more stuff, well, when you get more stuff, there goes your revolutionary impulse. And we've seen that in the course of the 20th century. We've seen revolutionary communism give way to banal bourgeois social democrat obsession with faggots and other kinds of perverts and racial mongrels. I mean, that's why they had to do this, because you could no longer energize. I mean, this is where cultural Marxism had to be implemented. This is where you had to shift the mechanism of destroying what is left of something resembling a healthy society. You had to shift it from the economic struggle to these bourgeois pet concerns. I mean, in America, the old trade unionists, one of the main purposes was to shut out European ethnics and Negroes.
Right.
And so you have a schizophrenia in the hard left. I mean, or take the 68ers in France. I mean, these communist types were the most staunchly opposed to immigration. And once this was placated, you had a shift to bourgeois pet concerns. I mean, if you're talking about a proletarian class struggle, where do the lumpenproll Negroes and weird bourgeois perverts fit into this?
Well, they are the proletariat, man. If you ask any of the people,
doesn't the proletariat have to work?
Well, here's the thing though. Like this is, and I guess this is the illusory sort of, or rather the slipperiness of these terms, right? If you go on Twitter right now and DM Jacobite magazine, or if you tweet at a Vice journalist and ask them whether or not they're a proletarian, they'll tell you yes. Right? Doesn't matter that they're netting 50 grand, a month, or more, or and living off of their rich Jewish financier parents. They're working class, because working class, or at least the new definition of proletarian, is someone who slums. Someone who who's seen rough things, man. They saw a fight outside of a bar once. So that means you're working class. It's the illusion. It's the pretense of these things. It's not really. There's no meaning behind it anymore.
Because all other forms of masculinity have been degraded so badly. Like this is seen as something masculine, heroic, when essentially everything that was has been executed from society.
Yeah. I mean that's that's.
Well, maybe not execute, like commercialized, maybe is a better word in an American context.
Yeah, I'm trying to, like, I don't
Revolution, Big
even,
Mac.
like, I don't even think like modern communists even have like a conception of the heroic anymore. I mean, I think this is how badly they've drunk from the well of the '68 counter revolutions, or the '68 social revolutions. Um, I don't think that they even have a conception of the heroic, because for much of
Well,
their
it should also be remembered that there would never have been any kind of communist revolutions without support from the upper classes.
That's true.
Like there never was a proletarian revolution. This is all communist mythology.
Right. Well, yeah. What's Bowden's line that there was never such a there was never a thing as the October Revolution was just a coup, which is true.
Yeah,
Historically speaking.
I'm not familiar with Budden's line on that, but that's literally what happened. A bunch of Jews just
Jewish
murdered
coup.
the royal family, and all the apparatchiks declared in the chaos of this, it's like, okay, we're the government now.
Yeah.
You've just underwent, citizen, you have underwent a workers' revolution. That's the extent of it. I mean, the whole thing was a sham. And so, no, the idea that there was ever like really a motivating, like a proletarian struggle, I mean, this is all garbage.
Well, maybe then they are true to themselves. Then maybe that's I took communism at its word. I'll never do that again. All right, so let's get back to the text here. This is the next section, next chapter, which is Occult War and Weapons of the Occult War. According to the protocols, it is the protocols of the elder learners of Zion, the leaders of the global plot are Jews who planned and undertook the destruction of the traditional Christian European civilization in order to achieve the universal rule of Israel, or God's chosen people. This is obviously an exaggeration. At this point, we may even
Obviously.
What's up?
I said obviously.
Obviously. NSA, if you're listening. At this point, we may even wonder whether a fanatical anti-Semitism, which always sees the Jews as a deus ex machina, is not unwittingly playing into the hands of the enemy. One of the means employed by the occult forces to protect themselves consists of directing their opponent's attention towards those who are only partially responsible for certain upheavals, thus concealing the rest of the story, namely a wider sequence of causes. It could be shown that even if the protocols were a forgery perpetrated by provocateurs, nevertheless they reflect ideas very congenial to the law and spirit of Israel. Second, it is true that many Jews have been and still are among the promoters of modern disorder in its more radical cultural expressions, whether political or social. This, however, should not prevent a deeper analysis, capable of exposing forces that may have employed modern Judaism merely as an instrument. After all, despite the fact that many Jews are among the apostles of the main ideologies regarded by the protocols as instruments of global subversion, i.e., liberalism, socialism, scientism, and rationalism, it is also evident that these ideas would never have arisen and triumphed without historical antecedents, such as the Reformation, humanism, the naturalism and individualism of the Renaissance, and the philosophy of Descartes. Such phenomena cannot be attributed to Judaism, but rather point to a wider web of influences. The secret forces of global subversion knew exactly that the basis of the order to be destroyed consisted in the supernatural element, that is, in the spirit, conceived not only as a philosophical abstraction or as an element of faith, but as a superior reality, as reference point for the integration of everything that is human. After limiting the influence that could be exercised in this regard by Christianity through the spread of materialism and scientism, the forces of global subversion have endeavored to conveniently divert any tendency toward the supernatural arising outside dominant religion and the limitation of its dogmas. So-called neo-spiritualism not only in its more deleterious spiritualist forms, but also in its pseudo-Eastern and occultist forms, not to mention the theories concerning the unconscious, the irrational, and so on, is greatly influenced by the tactic of inversion. Instead of rising toward what is beyond the person as a really supernatural element, here we remain in a subpersonal and in an infractional, according to an inversion that quite often has sinister characteristics. The most important sphere for this application of the knowledge of the weapon of the occult war is the inner one, the world of one's own thoughts. It is here that one needs to be on guard. It is here that one should be able to recognize the subtle influences and try to suggest ideas and reactions to us in certain situations. If this can be accomplished, even if it is still not possible to identify the enemy in our midst, it would at least bar him the main paths of his secret action. We should recall the myth of the learned elders of the protocols. Compare to them men who see only facts like dumb animals. There is little hope that anything may be solved when among the leaders of the new movement there are no men capable of integrating the material struggle with a secret and inexorable knowledge. One that is not at the service of dark forces but stands instead on the side of the luminous principle of traditional spirituality.
Yeah, peak esoteric.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, his take on the protocols is more or less like, okay, this might have been forged or whatever, but that doesn't mean it isn't true, because it's indicative of greater superpersonal forces. And pretty good take on the protocols, actually, because to say either A, forged, or B, plagiarized further begs the question. Because if it's quote-unquote forged, well, why does it accurately describe certain forces at work? I mean, how is that a forgery?
Right.
I guess the extent of the forgery is that it purports to be written by this secret society. So maybe that part is untrue. But if it's plagiarized, then what you plagiarize what from yourself? Ultimately, he references Guignon and is like, well, a true secret society wouldn't write this down, Yeah, probably true, but protocols are a subject in of themselves. Suffice to say, my take on this part is he's describing sort of the bigger picture war of ideas. You're at the mercy of these forces beyond your knowledge. You exist in the soup of the Judeo-Masonic soup. It tastes like shit, and you're drowning.
Well, that's definitely who I sort of pictured he was referencing here, with allusions to forces outside Judaism, and that would be Masonry. And there is.
He mentions it explicitly too.
And there is, I mean, this is a historical fact that, the Enlightenment, the revolutions of the Enlightenment were brought about by, a Masonic agenda. Speak to the American Revolution.
And particularly the revolution that he is always referencing.
Yes.
The French Revolution is these warring secret societies and Judeo-Masonic cabal behind the scenes to destroy the aristocracy, etc. I would also remind, it's liberalism. Codriani's dictum comes to mind of, the Jew, like the mosquito, thrives in the swamp of our sins. It's not, Evola is not here to attribute the decline of the traditional order and the aristocratic world to the Jew, or even to the Masons, or even to the convergence between them. He would never deny their significant influence, but he would also ultimately attribute this to a weakening of the order
by the process of cyclical decline and the embrace of liberal creeds that paved the way for this. Which, I mean, this is a big subject, but
it's a culmination of like you said, multiple different movements working within the framework of history. But he doesn't really I don't like this kind of just saying all of them forcing themselves into one. Like, I think definitely some have more of a contribution than that of others. Like, I kind of think he kind of passes over the emphasis of how much Jews' role have been within the course of revolutions and so forth. Like,
well,
just to say it was a culmination of everything. Yeah, that's what I think.
Metaphysical. He says it on the outset. He says, we're not going to be discussing the dimension of time and space and of historical actors and people, but the subterranean forces at work. That's what he says in the opening there.
Well, and I do think that just speaking historically, up until the emancipation of the Jews, the Masonic forces at play were the senior partner in the destruction of the West. Jews have always been an issue. From their subjugation by Rome, to the present. But it's been the damage that they're able to inflict grows over time. Whereas I'd say with Masonry, I wouldn't say that they're much of a threat now. More or less a dead cult.
I wouldn't say necessarily like Masonry's end goal was like the destruction of the West on like the Judaic kind of conception. Like it was ultimately like not beneficial to the West, but it, in a sense, didn't have this idea. Okay, we're here to like subordinate these people to something because we view them as inferior.
Yeah, I mean the question of it's funny when you read, like, I have, I believe, the Inner Traditions copy of this. The introduction is like 120 pages long, and like 70% of that is dedicated to clarifying Evola's fascism, racism, and anti-Semitism, because the people who are taking an interest in this are, esotericists or whatever, New Age people, and they want to be able to like read Evola and not have to be burdened by icky bad think. And even, I mean, the appendix of this book is his defense. They close. It's like you read this whole thing and then they close out with his appendix and his like legal defense for after having been accused of being the source of inspiration for various neo-fascist groups in post-war Italy. And he was arrested for this, and they close out on this. It's the whole thing is really strikes me the wrong way. Just the way all of this is framed. I mean, Evola's anti-Semitism, like it, and that word, it's like, I mean, come on, guys. Like, I don't know what more to say. I mean, he takes a very high level approach to, because I mean, I guess what I would say is that similar to I was talking about the Codriani's thoughts, like you can't oppose, like if these people have a competing worldview, if these various sort of high power elite forces, Jews, Anglos, Dutchmen, Masons, whatever the grand conspiracy was or is, you can't really oppose this unless you have something of your own, something effective. You have your own state, your own power that is derived from superior principles. Otherwise, you're always going to play into their hands, is sort of his case, and he is right about that. I mean, look, on the North American continent, if you're going to demand, like, look, okay, we're being persecuted and we want our own space,
to survive. Well, I mean, you've never confront these big picture. Maybe that's the correct way to go, or whatever. I'm not going to comment on that, but at the end of the day, you are still buying into the framework,
the paradigm of
material concerns, et cetera, et cetera. It's all rather exhausting when you think about it, because, I mean, can you really blame someone for merely asking to survive? What are we all supposed to be demanding, like high metaphysical principles for our survival? This is the tension I have with this stuff, and it's not because I am pro-Americanist or liberalism. It's because it is so far removed from the American tradition that, like, what are we to do?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would take a similar view. Well, I kind of conceive his worldview as not like fully true, but like his metaphysics of history definitely something which I find admirable, and I have very similar relations to. Yet it can't be implemented within modern society. And he understood this. We'll read the conclusion soon to his whole novel. But in Rather Tiger, he pretty much says the conclusion of this novel is it can't be practical. It was at a certain time period it could have been, but history has shown that it was useless.
Yeah, his answer to these questions is in Ride the Tiger, but the answer remains. It's where you end up with the Varg pill.
Yeah.
I mean, you want the beast to tire itself out and die, and you can maybe maintain your soul and an attachment to principles. At the end of the day, though, kind of the big looming contradiction. I mean, you might as well go ahead with the conclusion, Leto, but like to me, the big looming contradiction, and you see this a lot. I'm gonna have to go here. Like, you see this a lot in fans of Evola who fancy themselves to be like these aristocrats, like this true elite. You know, you got to learn the right lessons from Evola, as in, like, you have to actually live in the world.
Yeah.
And yes, you want to keep your soul, but, like, no, you're not. The people have this, like, weird idea that, like, having all the right ideas. Oh, I'm a monarch. I'm an Evolian monarchist. It's like, dude, get the fuck out.
It's also, I mean, ironically, that's also like an inherently materialistic view.
That's my point, Titus. You got me. No, dude, you got me.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly where I was going with this. It's like it's ultimately like I have the right ideas. I will prevail, like, in my, apart from the rest, I'm going to be okay, and I'll keep my principles and blah 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 blah. I mean, look, like, we're on this together. Yeah. I mean, not all of us. I mean, I'm happy to lose, like, I don't know, we could lose a pretty large chunk of our race, and I wouldn't bat an eye. Yeah. But those of us who are at least going to engage in this conversation in the first place, we are all in this together. And you shouldn't pat yourself on the back for knowing better than the next guy, and being more spiritually sophisticated. Oh, go a great fucking deal, guy. I mean, try applying these, like, try doing anything in this world and not getting shut the fuck down by the pig system. I mean, like, this entire discussion of metaphysical, like, we're under hardcore oppression. And yes, like, these concerns are correct, like building something that will last, building 1,000-year Reich, building the new Rome. It would need metaphysical principles. It would need a higher order. But we're so far removed from that so much of this is as brilliant as Evola was, and as much as, like, he is representative of a better order of man than I guess we'll probably arrive at ourselves. I think at the end of the day, like, we have to just carry on with what we've got.
Well, he's the we can view him as sort of a platonic form, This is a perfect society that is thoroughly organic and subscribes to the sacred laws of nature, And the goal is not to act as if that this is the paradigm in which we are living in, because it is most assuredly not. It's the fact that we need to try as we might and fail, in some ways. We should.
He points in the direction of an ideal.
Yeah.
He points in the direction of something that we might eventually arrive at.
Yeah, move towards.
But to try to LARP as Evola himself,
Right.
to try to pretend like you are this aristocrat who is like so far removed from the bull fucking shit,
Yeah.
dude. You're not. You're not. You're in the same fucking shit as the rest of us, and you know it.
I'll move on to the conclusion. I think that was pretty good.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Do we even need this? All right.
Sorry.
So
Go for it.
just keep that in your mind while you're listening to this.
Form and presuppositions of a united Europe. The need for a united Europe is strongly felt in various milieus today. It is necessary to distinguish where this need is upheld on a merely material and pragmatic level from those situations in which this issue is posited at a higher level, emphasizing spiritual and traditional values. In the best case, similar needs arise from an inner rebellion against the existing situation, due to the sight of Europe which, following the concomitant actions and reactions in which we should also recognize the part played by the occult war, has been thrown from its role as a great subject in world politics and became an object conditioned by foreign interests and influences. Today, Europe has to live between two superpowers struggling for control of the world, the USA and the USSR, and eventually accept an American and Atlantic protection in order to avoid a worse scenario, total enslavement to communism. In order to head towards a united Europe, the first step should consist of a concerted exit of all European nations from the United Nations, which is an illegitimate, promiscuous, and hypocritical association. Another obvious imperative should be to become emancipated in every aspect and in equal measure from both the United States and the USSR. However, this would require a very subtle and prudent political art, for which today's politicians are hardly qualified. The reason is that a significant interval between the rejection of the American and Atlantic tutelage and the effective organization of Europe into a united bloc capable of defending itself, where possible, could cause Europe, which is still materially and spiritually weak, to fall prey to communism and the USSR as a result of inner upheavals and external aggressions. Thus, a work of preparation should precede such initiatives. In a united Europe, fatherlands and nations may exist. Ethnic communities have always been partially respected, even in the totalitarian Soviet Union. What should be excluded is nationalism, with its monstrous appendix, namely imperialism and chauvinism. In other words, every fantastical absolutization of a particular unit. Thus, European empire and not nation Europa or European fatherland should be the right term in a doctrinal sense. In the Europeans, we should appeal to a feeling of higher order, qualitatively very different from the nationalistic feelings rooted in other strata of the human being. We cannot claim to be Europeans on the basis of an analogous feeling, due to which one feels Italian, Prussian, Basque, Finnish, Scottish, Hungarian, and so on, or believe that a unique feeling of the same kind may become widespread, thereby erasing and leveling these differences and replacing them in a nation Europa. What is needed is an organic unity. The premise should rather be the integration and consolidation of a single nation as a hierarchical, united, and well-differentiated whole. What is required is not to impose a common regime on every European nation. However, an organic, hierarchical, anti-individualistic, and anti-democratic principle should be adequately implemented, even though in various forms adopted to different circumstances. Thus, the preliminary condition of a general anti-democratic cleansing would be at the present appears to be almost utopian. Having put the problem in these terms, there are serious difficulties regarding the spiritual, not merely political, foundations required to implement this European unity. Where should we find these foundations? Little can be done on the higher and proper plane, which is the religious one. We cannot refer to Catholicism, asking it to become the sanction and the anointer of a superordained principle of authority, first of all because Catholicism is the faith of only some European nations. Second, due to the democratic and modernizing collapse of the contemporary church. And third, due to the effects of the general process of desacralization and secularization which have occurred in Europe. Least of all, can an appeal be made to a generic Christianity, since this would be weak, insubstantial, and formless, not specifically European, and not liable to be monopolized by European civilization alone. After all, even American blacks are Christian. The requirement is to proceed to an inner detoxification, carried through as far as it is possible, even at the highest price. For instance, beside the political and economic domains, how can we fail to recognize the degree in which Americanization has spread among the European masses, in manner of customs, taste, and fashion? European contributions, through books, writers, artists, researchers, etc., have been absorbed by non-European countries, and non-European contributions by European countries, such as general leveling, which is now extending also to lifestyles and tastes, together with the leveling that is furthered by science and technology, has been used as an argument by those who do not want a united Europe, but rather a united world, a supranational organization or world government. We cannot side either with the pro-European sympathizers, who we only refer to what was attempted in fascist Italy or Nazi Germany before the war, toward the creation of a new order. These groups fail to recognize that fascism and National Socialism were movements and regimes in which different and even contrasting tendencies coexisted. Their development in the right, positive, revolutionary conservative sense could have occurred only if circumstances had allowed for an adequate further development, which was stricken down by the war they ignited and by their ensuing defeat. This is how we should at least proceed to a precise distinction, if we want to draw reference points to those movements. Before 1945, we could at least witness the wonderful sight of the principle of a national European army, and the legionary spirit of volunteers from many nations who, having been organized in several divisions, fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. At that time, the foundation was the Third Reich. We could suggest the idea of an order whose members would act in various nations, doing what they can to promote an eventual European unity, even if such unfavorable conditions. The enthusiasm of young militants who conduct active propaganda should be commended, but it is not enough. We should count on people with specific qualifications, who occupied or intended to occupy key positions in their own nations. What kind of men could be up to such a task? Assuming bourgeois society and civilization as a reference point, it is necessary to win over to the cause and recruit people who neither spiritually belong to the bourgeoisie or are affected by it, or who are already beyond it. Naturally, the personality of an authentic leader at the center and head of the order is of utmost importance. Unfortunately, no such person exists today. It would be dangerous and rash to see him in any of these figures who are currently working here and there, albeit with the best intentions, selflessly and bravely to form European groups. One is to consider One has to consider here that no one could have detested in advance the potential of any of the men who later became leaders of great movements. Nevertheless, it is easy to see the great advantage in the case where such a man, in whom authority and status now became manifest, had been there from the beginning. In summary, let it be said that breaking through into the more thoughtful minds is the idea that is the current state of affairs, and uniting of Europe into a single bloc is the indispensable prerequisite for its continuation in a form other than an empty geographical concept on the same materialistic level as that of the powers that seek to control the world. For all the reasons already explained, we know that this crisis involves a dual inner problem. If under these circumstances, one hopes to establish a firm foundation, a deeper sense, and an organic character of a possible united Europe. On the one hand, an initiative in the sense of a spiritual and psychic detoxification must be taken against what is commonly known as quote-unquote modern culture. On the other, there is the question of the kind of metaphysics that is capable today of supporting both a national and supranational principle of true authority and legitimacy. The dual problem can be translated into a dual imperative. It remains to be seen which and how many men, in spite of it all, still stand upright among so many ruins, in order that they may make this task their own.
Yeah, so I'd agree with Evola in this ideal point of that, of like the European empire and so forth. Like it seems like an end goal more superior to that than nationalistic states. But Nick like references multiple times before, in our necessary condition, like whether or not we need to appeal to these ideals, I don't think it's absolutely necessary. Whether we achieve it, the overturning of a tide of something that's overcoming us, whether we go through nationalism or this pan-Europeanism, doesn't really bother me either way.
Well, people know me. I am something of a Yaki fanboy to an extent. In that he speaks to a certain American perspective on this issue, because I can say personally I feel a certain responsibility for the fact that the state that I live under is the state oppressing Europe.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
So I want to see that come to an end. And as to the thing with like both Yaki and Evola, like they're writing in the post-war era, and they're writing both with a certain degree of optimism. I mean, Evola's pretty tempered by a disappointment with all. Contrary to Yaki, was quite enamored with the German movement of the 20th century, and Evola had pretty significant criticisms. However, both compared, like, if these guys were able to live into the 90s and 2000s, I mean, it's quite a different picture. So it's, they're kind of offering like a best case scenario. In case of Evola, like, how do we revive or come to something truly European in the political order? It's interesting too that in this entire book he's not talking about America. It's kind of funny. It's almost like he can't handle addressing America. Like, I get him not wanting to give a social criticism of America, but it's like, how can you talk about the post-war European order in any context without writing extensively on America? Yeah. You can't. I mean, and Yaki is much more explicit on this question. However, all that being said, we've gone so far down the road. I mean, we've entered a clown world to where, looking at what's going on in Europe now, I mean, and look at, I don't know, some fucking Afghan, raping little children and being given, a lollipop or whatever. this isn't is this really the context to talk about like metaphysical, like, super state ideals?
Yeah.
I mean,
we're castrating 9-year-old boys. Like, I'm sorry.
it's
I can get on board. I'm a romantic at heart. I love the idea of dreaming of the ideal society, and I think a lot of people. I would wager the vast majority of people in the dissident right are romantics, because we are idealists in a lot of ways. Um, we need to temper that with some pragmatism, and we need to sort of face what we're dealing with head on before we get
yeah. I
to.
mean, there's this idea we can ideology or think our way out of this. That we can, if we just adopt the right. I mean, and that's even on the best. There's some people who are even worse, who are like,
can
well,
vote
we
our
can only
way.
tweak the Americanist. Yeah, if we can only tweak the Americanist scheme a little bit, everything, we just need a bunch of Donald Trumps over and over again.
Yeah.
Like, no. I mean, my personal view, and I hope I don't get lynched for this, I think we need to think of ourselves like the barbarians outside the gates of Rome. And I think we need to sack these places and I don't want to kill all of our enemies and raise these cities to the fucking ground.
Yes.
And I don't think that's I think honestly, like, I have a personal motto, which is racial struggle is the purification of the soul. I may get in trouble for that one too, but like at the end of the day, like, what will kill this beast that's looming over all of our heads in America, Europe, the Anglosphere, in Leto's country? If we can muster something that can destroy this thing, that will put us on the footing towards something that Evola describes, towards the creation of some kind of elite who can represent something more, who can look out for the long-term future, for the higher principles. But I think there's this strand of wishful thinking that we can arrive at that without having to do the dirty work. They all want to be aristocrats and generals, but none of them want to be soldiers.
Right.
None of them want to be the men who actually have to address this, who have to implement the idea. And I in some ways, I don't really see Evola like, I've personally gotten a lot out of reading Evola. But it's certainly like, if you had every white man of fighting age reading Evola, I don't think that's going to achieve much. I think they'd be better off reading George Lincoln Rockwell, to be honest with you. I probably get in trouble for that too. but seriously, guys, I mean, it's interesting stuff. It really is.
But it is despite the. I want to choose my words carefully here.
Titus.
Yeah, despite the sort of idealism on display in terms of having a permanent solution, we do just sort of have to reconcile with the necessity of action and not necessarily concern ourselves, or rather hope that through, let's call it a poetic license here, a purifying fire, we're able to enact a better society. I mean, that's really all we can realistically hope for at this point. So having dreams of just any sort of system of government outside of the one that we are currently fighting.
Well, it's not a theory of heroism we need. It's actual heroes.
We actually need heroism, yeah.
We don't need a bunch of men writing essays about what heroism would look like. We want people to do it.
Right.
And there's so many places people are afraid to say it because there's a lot of fear of crossing the line, this proverbial line.
Mm-hmm.
But look, guys, y'all know the stakes.
Yeah.
Okay? I'm not going to say anything more.
Yeah. We survive.
No, I think you definitely hit the criticism of Evola perfectly. While I think his books like Revolt Against the Modern World and Metaphysics of War are something very like inspiring and idealing. They're not practical, and this book particularly doesn't give us any way forward. And neither does his ideology currently. We have to move with something else. We can't just go with this straight up fucking spirituality where we're applying metaphysics. Like you said, we aren't going to get through with ideas. It's something we need men of action. But to point, just maybe to give him some credit, this book isn't meant for like the mass of people. It is meant for like an aristocratic nature or a warrior path.
It's definitely something to be kept in the back of your mind. I mean, because to give the other side, he is right when you have sort of a crude obsession with, I don't know, you see a lot amongst white nationalists of just, well, if it's white, it's okay. And Evola is a good anecdote to that kind of thinking. No, like, ideas do matter. There's no question about that. We're looking for a happy middle ground here, guys. I mean, like, ideas matter, but so does blood. So does, like, you want to be all metaphysical and anti-material. Well, what is the source of your contemplation? What is the source of this ability? Blood matters. And he goes to pains to try to negate that in the context of National Socialist Germany, and to a certain extent, I guess, Italy. But from the American context, it's a little bit different. I mean, I think he would be happy to write us off. So if that's the case, well, why should we really be hanging on his every word for our destiny? I mean, I don't think so.
I think I think that's the proper lens to read Evola. That elitism is good and necessary, specifically not just within the world, within sort of the macro worldview, but also just sort of within ourselves and within our own movement. But don't make that elitism stultifying. Don't make it aloofness, because
make it something you earn.
Yeah.
You don't arrive at it through like intellectualism. You're not some intellectual because you've done nothing. You've achieved nothing. I'm reminded of the Pretender song, Mystery Achievement. It's like, yes, you've achieved this, and no one will ever know about it. You've become a great aristocrat, and you'll die being taken care of by Laquanda in a old folks' home. Like, I don't know, man. I would say we should keep in mind that there's more than the material. There's more than just the political struggle. Mm-hmm. But none of this is going to matter much unless we have some breathing room. We get this boot off of our necks, because if we do not get this boot off our necks, it will kill us. Yeah. And all of this is moot. Yeah.
Well, I think with that, we should close out our episode with that. This has been episode 57, Men Among the Runes. Leto, always good to have you. Nick, you're always welcome back, my friend.
Thanks, man. Thanks, guys.
Well,
thanks for joining us, Nick.
Until next time, hail victory.